was, of course, extreme. But I don't think it was truly an exception. I think all populists employ the kind of language that he employed when they talk about their opponents. Secondly, and less obviously, I think, populists will also claim that all those, if you like, among the people, among citizens, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the real people, and who logically, therefore, do not support the populists politically, that all those people might have their status as properly belonging to the people put into doubt. Let me illustrate that thought with two recent examples. Many of you will remember Nigel Farage's speech, still during the night of Brexit, when he said that the outcome of the referendum had been what he called a victory for real people, implying, of course, that the 48% who wanted to stay inside the EU, well, on some level, aren't quite real. Donald Trump gave a speech in May 2016, which, given the other stuff he said during the campaign, was hardly noticed, but which in many ways I think was deeply revealing. He said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything. I hope you can see the point. The populist decides who truly belongs to the people, even if you happen to have, in this case, an American passport, even if you legally belong, the populist can decree that you do not belong. Now, if I may add one thought, and this sort of goes back to also a debate we started to have last night, I believe that populists, even if they don't win elections, can have a detrimental effect on democratic political cultures. I'm not saying, again to clarify a point from last night, I'm not saying that if they end up as minor coalition partners in a government, we should expect, that the Gulag will be reopened and horrible human rights violations will necessarily happen. Not at all. But still, what they do and how they talk is really not how other democratic actors talk and ultimately act. What do I mean? I mean that actually any populist party that doesn't win an election or doesn't get an overwhelming majority even at the polls has an almost logical problem, if what I've been trying to say is correct. Because how can it be that they and they alone are the representatives of the people, and yet they are not in government? So one way to get out of that contradiction that populists often, not always to be sure, but very often employ, is in effect to take another look at that infamous expression, the silent majority. And what they end up saying is that, well, look, if the majority weren't silent, we would always already be in power, by definition. So maybe we shouldn't be talking about the silent majority, maybe it's a case of the silenced majority. Maybe something or somebody kept the majority from truly expressing itself. Hence, the very frequent, again, not always, but very frequent tendency by these actors to call into question election results. Trump is an obvious contender for this. You remember how in November 2016 he said, well, if I accept the results, if she wins, I'll tell you at the time. Of course, everybody understood what that really meant. According to some surveys, 70% of Trump supporters went on record as saying that if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. I think any democratic political culture where you see these sorts of results has a bit of a problem. Or an example from a country which is about to have a vote on Sunday, Austria. You remember the very contested presidential election there last year, maybe. Eventually, the person who was, in effect, the populist contender, the man of the people, and who lost, which really wasn't possible because the guy who won was an old green professor from Vienna with dubious ethnic heritage. A man like this, by definition, cannot win against the man of the people. Okay? So eventually, Norbert Hofer, who was actually whose portrait was on here earlier today, eventually kind of conceded. But he said something which, in and of itself, was deeply revealing. And I apologize for the fact that it only really works beautifully in German. He said, the winner, ist gezählt, aber ist nicht gewählt. In other words, he was saying, yes, the numbers add up. Okay, I accept in the end, okay, the numbers are in his favor, but he hasn't really been elected. Now this is, for those who care about these sorts of references, this is pure Carl Schmitt. This is opening up a division between statistics, numbers, the kind of stuff that liberal democracy does, and a different idea of democracy, where there is some real people out there, an almost metaphysical entity, which can make a different decision by way of acclamation, by some other way that, you know, can remain quite mysterious, but that does the true election somehow. And I would simply say that a normal, quote-unquote, democratic politician doesn't talk like this. What these people all end up doing is, of course, communicating to their supporters that our democracies might just be a facade, that there's always something else going on behind the scenes, that elites are manipulating the process, and so on and so forth. Now, to be sure, I hasten to add that, of course, it's completely all right to criticize our existing, let's say, election systems, forms of representation, and so on. There's plenty to criticize. What I'm simply claiming is that somebody who ends up saying, because I didn't win, our system must be bad and rigged, someone like that is offering a ultimately non-democratic version of critique. All right, very briefly, how does this sort of stance relate to the three factors I mentioned at the beginning? So my hypotheses would be the following. The increasing conflict between openness and closure does not predetermine that populists will rise or win or anything, but it's a set of issues where they feel they can say something. Because to some degree, these are questions of belonging and not belonging. If our deepest conflicts were different, if they were, let's say, about bioethics, or if we actually took global warming seriously, it's not obvious, to me at least, that populists would play a very big role in these debates. What would they say beyond don't trust the experts on this question? Whereas in terms of debates that ultimately also revolve around identity, the identity of the people, and so on, they have something to say, which is not to say that they are correct, but they're very strong potentially in those sorts of discourses. Secondly, and this has been said many times before, of course, the convergence of other parties, especially in the form of converging on the so-called third way, I think it's fair enough, paved the way for populists because they could advance a claim that was reasonable enough where they said, where are the people in all this? So we're basically being told there is one reasonable center and then there are sort of crazy extremists on the left and crazy extremists on the right. So this quasi-technocratic stance where disagreement, if you disagree with this supposedly unique, reasonable center, you basically reveal yourself as irrational or extremist because there is one reasonable policy answer, everything else is just sort of crazy extremism. This, of course, makes it easier for populists to say, where are the people in this, where are choices? And just as a footnote, if I may, one of the ironies of developments like this is, of course, that even though then technocracy, for shorthand, and populism look like two extremes, they actually also share one characteristic, because they both are forms of anti-pluralism. Technocracy says only one correct policy solution. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. The populist says only one authentic will of the people, and only we know and represent it. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be a traitor to the people, and so on and so forth. So everything that we usually might think of as democracy, choice, debate, disagreement, the kind of stuff that happens in parliaments, disappears if we end up with just these two extremes. And I think we saw actually precisely this pattern in the context of the Euro crisis in particular. This increasing polarization between here's one rational policy answer and then populists saying, but the real people are thinking something else. Lastly, and I'll just allude to this with one sentence, as already we talked about this morning, it's far too early to come up with grand diagnoses about this structural transformation of the public sphere, if indeed it is one. But in a certain way, of course, it might have made it easier for populists to mobilize, partly on the basis of a specific, if you like, anti-professional reaction to supposedly elite journalists. It's become much more possible to connect people who have a reaction against that, for whatever precise reason, than was the case before. I mean, I don't want to get into this now, but if some of you are interested in talking about this, I think it's one of the ironies or paradoxes of our time that on one level we do live in deeply anti-authoritarian times where professional knowledge is systematically questioned. But even though it's anti-authoritarian, it's not progressive. And in that sense, it can translate into phenomena like what I'm talking about in terms of populism. All right, if I may, the two normative bits. So first of all, if you find anything useful in what I've been trying to say about populism, one effect perhaps might be that we become more careful in how we understand certain phenomena. And we become perhaps less willing to let some of our leaders, especially but not only in the European Union, get away with basically branding or condemning certain new parties and movements as populists. So you remember, leading representatives of the EU, Barroso, Van Rompuy, and others basically saying, oh, all these crazy populists, left, right, Podemos, Syriza, Le Pen, etc. It's all sort of the same thing. They're all anti-European. It's all a big danger. This, I think, to say the very least, is deeply counterproductive. Because some of these movements, I think, should be much more understood as potentially being part of a renewal of representative democracy. And very often it's sort of ironic how people basically end up in a position, observers now, not EU representatives, but they basically say, oh, if in Greece you only have PASOK and New Democracy, it's post-democracy, no real choice. Then you have Syriza, and then the people still say, oh, it's crisis of representation because it's an insurgent protest populist party. And you want to say, well, what exactly do you want? I mean, if it's like this is crisis of representation, if it's like that, it's also crisis of representation. So in other words, the thesis cannot be disproven because there's always something which supposedly conforms to this particular diagnosis. And especially in the case of Spain, which I'm sure many of you know better than I do, so I'm willing to be corrected if you think this is wrong. But especially in the case of Spain, I think a good case can be made that Podemos has really been part of trying to solve a crisis of representation, that in the old days, you really could say very plausibly, here are two corrupt parties, and they really were corrupt. So not everybody who talks about corruption is a populist, of course. PP and PSOE really were a sort of version of post-democracy. Then, young people go out, they protest. Eventually, some of them form a party. They mobilize people, especially young, highly educated people who had basically said bye-bye to the party system, came back to the polls, and most important, when they lost, they accepted it. And that's not obvious. It's not obvious if you think back a little bit in European history that young people, in some cases, whose life chances have virtually already been destroyed. They're never going to catch up, okay? I mean, after this level of youth employment, even if magically everything turns around, they've lost already so much. That people like this basically dutifully form a party and eventually give losers consent. You just need to think about the 1970s in Europe to remember that sometimes young people who have deep objections to an existing system have other ideas about what they could possibly do. So that's one thing. I think we should basically be much more careful in how we frame certain new phenomena. Secondly, very briefly, if I may, how should one deal with actual populists, which is to say actual anti-pluralists as they have emerged in many European countries, as they are now in the latest iteration, very present for the first time really in the German parliament. Just a couple of suggestions. So I think by now we've learned, especially but maybe not only, through the European experience, that two very widespread approaches certainly do not work. The first one is total exclusion. So basically the stance where politicians say, we won't even talk to you. If you show up in a talk show, I will not appear on the stage with you. If this party asks questions in Parliament, we will not answer them, we will walk out, this sort of stuff. This clearly is the wrong stance, both on a strategic level, but maybe less obviously on a democratic theory level. It's wrong on a strategic level because by taking this position, you of course entirely confirm the narrative which populist parties are always serving up to their own supporters. The elites never listen, there are all these taboo subjects that nobody dares to talk about, etc., etc. But on a democratic theory level, it seems to me also profoundly problematic that especially once these parties are in parliament, if you refuse systematically to engage with them, you essentially deny representation to their voters. And one of the sort of biggest political, but maybe also theoretical problems I see is that people are way too ready to infer from the rhetoric of the leaders the character of the voters. We cannot know whether all the voters of populist parties are themselves populists, which in my sense means anti-pluralists. We cannot know that. In some cases, it's a plausible hypothesis, but it's perfectly thinkable, for instance, if you permit a rather cliched example, that somebody says, look, all the stuff that Marine Le Pen says about the other parties, I don't really think that's true. You know, although, of course, you know, when people sort of, you know, employ their own family and they accept €1,000 suits from, you know, entrepreneurs, you might say it actually is mostly correct. But never mind that. You can say, look, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But you know what? The National Front has a fantastic agricultural policy. And I, as a farmer in a particular part of France, I just think this is my #1 policy preference. So you're essentially denying representation to that person if you refuse to accept his or her party in Parliament. The other extreme, the other approach from this is, of course, to put it very colloquially, to run after populists and to, in effect, start to copy them. Again, we're seeing this very clearly now in the German case, where a particular party has said, okay, we made a mistake, you know, we didn't really cover our right side, we need to kind of talk more talk that appeals to people who don't like refugees, and so on and so forth. Again, on a strategic level, it's very unlikely to work, because the usual response that has been given by many populists in Europe is, well, look, now they're copying us, but the original remains available, why don't you vote for the original? But again, it's also on a democratic theory level that something is profoundly wrong here. First of all, through these opportunistic concessions, you might end up shifting a whole political culture, in the case of right-wing populists, to the right, in a way that has had no proper democratic authorization. So let's say Denmark and the Netherlands end up in a position where I think for good reason citizens eventually say, how the hell did we end up here? This didn't feel like it was a collective choice that we really wanted to be much less friendly to refugees and immigrants and so on, but it was basically something that was pushed over time by mainstream parties. And secondly, and less obviously maybe, and also this goes back to a debate we started to have last night, very often observers but also politicians confronted with populism switch from a stance where they say, these demagogues, these liars, we don't believe a word of what they say, they have all these simplistic policy proposals, we can basically totally ignore them. They switch from that stance to a stance where they all of a sudden give populists a kind of sociological monopoly of understanding society. So all of a sudden one ends up saying things like, they know people's true sorrows and concerns. Well, yes, of course, somehow they gain traction because otherwise they wouldn't have, you know, increasing shares of the vote and so on. But very often I fear that this stance is based on a profoundly problematic understanding of how democratic representation works in the first place. After all, democratic representation is not like a mechanical reproduction of already existing identities, interests, and so on, objectively out there in society, so that, you know, the populists miraculously discover something that nobody else had understood. No, democratic representation is, after all, a dynamic process where the self-perception of citizens is partly based on particular, if you like, representational offerings by politicians, by parties, by civil society, friends, family, and so on. Which is not to say that it's all arbitrary or fictitious, but it's a lot more dynamic and malleable than generally is given credit for. So, for instance, you may remember that in many parts of the world, maybe, on November 9th last year, people woke up and they said, oh my God, it's the end, it's a catastrophe. But, you know, there's one upside. We always knew that America is totally racist, and now they've proven it. 63 million came out and proved to us conclusively that they're totally racist. Yes, of course, there are plenty of racists in the US. But to say that, oh, this is sort of empirical proof that, you know, basically Trump was closing the representation gap for racists, I think leaves out far too many other factors of what happened here. To some degree, it's true that, in a sense, through what he was offering, he was encouraging people to see themselves as what you might call part of a white identity movement. But this is not objective. This is not set in stone. This could change again. So especially when, you know, European socialist and social democratic parties sort of behind closed doors are saying, look, you know, it's terrible, but finally we have to accept that populists have proven to us that workers hate foreigners, you know, and now we kind of have to work around that. I think this is a big mistake. Anyway, if I have one more second, which I may not, one more second, because I've told you all these negative things, and you might be saying, does this guy have anything positive to say? I mean, especially in the US, people are supposed to come up with some uplifting, positive, you know, thing at the very end. So where is it? Very briefly, I think there's no alternative to engagement with populist actors. But talking with them does not mean talking like them. So you should have a completely open debate. You should basically, as a good politician, let's say, be able to make a distinction between all kinds of topics that can be part of a democratic debate. There's a wide variety of stances you can take on immigration, on economic policy, on refugees, and at least I would not say, oh, these stances are automatically undemocratic. They're not. But there's a difference between openly debating these stances and then hopefully relying on the force of the better argument to defeat some of these characters, and moments when populists specifically reveal themselves as populists in my sense of anti-pluralist, distrusting the democratic system as it is. So if, for instance, a populist politician says in a debate, there's a secret plan by Angela Merkel to replace the German folk with Syrians, it's very important that another politician immediately makes it clear that we've now left the territory of normal democratic debate about policy. Now, of course, the populist is not then going to recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was propounding a conspiracy theory. I won't do it again. Unlikely to happen. But the hope is that if you make these red lines very clear, you at the same time communicate to people, yes, there are real choices. We can debate all kinds of issues. But if this kind of talk starts, you as a citizen watching this, listening to this, you're going to have to make a choice yourself, whether you want to be in the same boat with people who have these sorts of attitudes, or ultimately not, even if you might share some of their policy views. So this might be a pious, naive hope from the point of view of democratic theory, but I think it's the best sort of stance at the level of politicians one can possibly take. We can also, if you like, talk about the level of citizens, but I know that my chair is already giving me, it's like minus 10 minutes already, I'm sure, so forgive me for having gone on a bit, and we can talk more later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can help me to open. So this goes very well with my subject. I'm going to speak more about the European Union and the democratic legitimacy. And I chose the slogan "No me representan," which came actually from, not from the populist movement, but from the indignados. So actually a protest movement, a social movement. And I want to show that actually in the moment of the global crisis, they were actually right, because the crisis management of the European Union was actually one that did not really match democratic legitimacy aspects. And I want to come, to something that Wolfgang Merkel said yesterday, and I was very happy when he talked about it yesterday. It has a lot to do with broken promises, because broken promises insofar that people were expecting globalization to bring prosperity for everybody. And in fact, they brought prosperity, but not for everybody. And they brought also a reduction or a halving of the extreme poverty in the world. But they brought at the same time, and this is actually a subject that has been in the literature for a long time, inequality. And I remember all of this inequality for all from Robert Reich, who was mentioning the subject. Joseph Stiglitz was publishing a lot about it. Thomas Piketty in the last years became very famous on it. And what is definitely one of the biggest achievements of Occupy Wall Street is that this subject is now a mainstream subject. It's in the discussion it's on the political agenda. What is interesting to see is the question, where is the famous trickling down? Huh? Because in liberal globalization, you should have, globalization should create the growth, and with the growth, automatically employment and prosperity for all. And in fact, even a few years ago, when I went with the European Parliament to the World Bank, they actually said, in fact, we discovered this does not exist. It doesn't, this mechanism doesn't work like this. It's going to the other direction. No. Yep. So, what about the European Union? There's a big frustration with the European Union because the European Union is a promise. The European Union should be bringing prosperity for the Europeans, for all Europeans, and should protect from globalization, should help to benefit from the advantages of globalization, but should protect from negative consequences of globalization. Yeah? But in fact, what happened, the European Union transformed itself into a kind of transmission belt for this, what you said, opening, and for liberalization and deregulation. Yeah, okay. What is interesting, this is like, I have a study from the Eurobarometer of April this year about designing Europe's future, trust in institution globalization. So there it comes out the majority believe that globalization is a good thing, but 4 in 6 believe also that, 4 in 10 believe that globalization is a threat to employment in companies in their country, and brings increasing social inequality. And they also, the conclusions brought out that the European Union is considered a mean to enable citizens to benefit from positive aspects of globalization and to help to protect citizens from negative. And additionally, so last year's Eurobarometer, social equality and solidarity should be emphasized in order to face global challenges, and social inequalities were seen as one of the main challenges for the European Union. So there is a big priority on social equality. So I did this one. Okay, I'm going back. Yeah, if we see here, trust in political institution, you can see this spike of 57 is the trust in the European Union. This was before the crisis broke out. There was a 57% trust in the European Union, which fell down with the crisis. So it is clear that the citizens were deceived in their trust to the European Union. And while actually what is interesting for me too in this, the European Union citizens have more trust in the European Union than they had in the national government and national parliaments. But the trust, the loss of the trust was stronger for the European Union. So the deception with the European Union was stronger than with the national parliaments and governments. So I said that the European Union transformed itself into a transmission channel for globalization because obviously there was the concept of the internal market. So you had for freedom, so you have to transform the economies of all the EU member states into one market. So you open up for goods and services, and you have a very strong control on free competition. And in that way, this led, particularly in the sense of freedom of services, to a lot of dismantling of public service or universal service. So they were constantly under attack from the European Commission, whether they have to liberalize these services. There were several proposals to come up with a services directive, which would also have seriously undermined social standards in the European Union and also environmental standards. And one that came through, that is actually on the agenda now of Macron, is the posting directive. And to explain a little bit, so a company in one of the European member states can send workers for a short time in another, and actually employs them and pays them in his country. Normally, they should be paid according to the country in which they work, but there's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of fraud in that. there had been initiatives to build a social dimension, and this was also during the time of Maastricht, of setting up the Economic and Monetary Union. And two figures were key, François Mitterrand and Jacques Delors. And Jacques Delors used to be his finance minister, became then the president of the European Commission. And he actually convinced both the European Trade Union Confederation, that's the ETUC, and I used to work there at that time, and also the TUC about the benefits of the European Union. So he said, and that was the time of Thatcher, look, brothers, the way to defeat Thatcher is to do it through Europe. So if we can mobilize to make social regulation in the European Union, you get it through the back door to the UK. And he convinced them. So labor movements and also the trade unions and the labor movements became strong supporters for European integration. And there was in the Maastricht Treaty was also a social chapter which granted social rights and social partner negotiations on EU legislation. But what happened then, these dimensions remained rather weak compared to the economic dimension. The internal market realized it was a big success, actually. In fact, then the crisis, the financial market got, yeah, I didn't say that, in the financial market was not only liberalized within the European Union, but globally. So when the crisis, the global financial crisis broke out, immediately it could swap over to Europe. And also it was many of the European banks and actors, financial market actors, that had a stake in the crisis also in the US. It's like the German bank, the Deutsche Bank, for example. So in fact, what role has the crisis? It actually accelerated this whole tendency, and the negative consequences of the integration and the negative consequences of globalization. So there was it led to more social cutting, more flexibilization of working conditions, more liberalization and deregulation. So in fact, the European Union did then not protect the citizens, but actually contributed even to the crisis. And I'm going to show also, additionally, showed a very incompetent crisis management. It was doing actually a muddling through. It was nothing that has to do with a professional crisis management. And this has to do because, in fact, we have an economic and monetary union, which in reality is only a monetary union. When the crisis broke out, we saw that actually the architecture of the economic and monetary union has major flaws. It has the internal imbalances, and before the crisis, we believed that the south of Europe is catching up. There was big growth, big financial flows from the north going to the south, a big boom, construction boom, tourist boom, services boom. But when the bubble burst, it led to the situation that these countries had a big public debts. Second, there was no instrument and tools in place to tackle with external shocks, and also with the possibility that there could be a sovereign default of an EU member state was actually never thought of. It was unthinkable. So it became a big shock, and there was no institution that was foreseen as a lender of last resort, because actually the ECB explicitly was forbidden to do this. Now we see economic and monetary union. Is it because the European Union is too supranational? In fact, in the economic and monetary union, there's only one part that is supranational. It's the monetary policy. So the monetary policy, but indeed, is not being done by the council, by the ministers. It's being done by the central bank. It's been delegated to the European Central Bank. Additionally, the European Central Bank is independent, so outside of political influence taking. And additionally, it has only the one main criteria, it's stability oriented, inflation, fighting inflation. And only if they can succeed that, they can think about growth policy and others. So it's different to the Federal Reserve, which has also an employment criteria, objectives. And the last thing, but not least, it has an accountability to the European Parliament, but this accountability only means the president of the ECB comes regularly to the European Parliament and talks about the policy, and the Parliament can ask questions, but they cannot change anything. Yeah? There's no way they can say you have to do this or that. Yeah? So this basically is just an information. And economic policy, although there is foreseen in the treaties that EU member states should consider their economic policy as of common interest, this was left completely intergovernmental. Yeah? So there were some targets with the Stability and Growth Pact and the broad economic policy guidelines and so on, but there was also no teeth. Huh? So you have to report what you did, and if you did some errors, you were being called a bad guy, yeah? But nothing major happened. Yeah? So even the big member states, France and Germany, they trespassed the 3% deficit criteria, and then they just abolished the sanctioning procedure. And what happened with the global financial crisis? So, in fact, the crisis management of the Eurozone was completely intergovernmental in nature, because it's not even economic and monetary union, it's Euro area, so only concerns the member state of the European Union, and these structures are completely informal. So they are not like an official part of the European Union structure, and they have no accountability at all, neither on the European Union level nor on the national level. And in fact, when the crisis broke out, they committed a policy that was basically a muddling through. So they were driven by the financial markets to come with quick solutions. There was no rules, and so the strongest can actually prescribe what it has to be done, or dictate the strongest to the weakest. Additionally, as I said already, there was a very strong influence of the financial markets. This was already before the crisis, so they made a lot of lobbying and pressure and were in a lot of expert panels, were representative of the financial markets who convinced that no regulation is the best regulation in the financial markets. When the crisis broke out, there was a bailing out of financial institutions without any conditionality or consequences. And when the governments had to fulfill afterwards policies to reduce the deficits that they actually took over because of the bailing out, they were driven by financial markets to do deregulation and flexibilization. So here is maybe more obvious. The Eurogroup, which is the finance minister, is an informal group. There was a big conflict with Varoufakis at that moment. He was criticizing that very much because there was simply no accountability to the European Parliament, nor to the national parliament. Here, maybe I have to make one addition. One could see in Germany that the German parliament was consulted about the terms of bailing out Greece. But in fact, when the Greeks voted, had elections, this had no consequence. They could not have realized the program that they voted on. Yeah? So additionally, then what happened, so this informal group that made major decisions on policies in the European Union, delegated even to the Troika. Okay. And this Troika is the ECB, the Commission, and the IMF. And just to mention, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and so the European Parliament had a commission which investigated the policies that they did and actually said, okay, this Troika violated EU norms, so they did not follow EU legislation. They violated EU legislation. They did not stick to the objectives of the European Union with Lisbon and Europe 2020, the Charter of the Fundamental Human Rights. And the European Court of Justice also criticized, gave them right, and said the Commission and the ECB actually remain EU institutions, even if they work within this framework, and are bound to the EU law, which they actually did not fulfill. So this is why the European Parliament and the national parliaments, they had a conference, and they came up saying that we have an increasing sense of a double democratic deficit in this enhanced economic governance framework of the European Union, both at EU and at national levels. And we need to find a way that both the European Parliament and national parliaments get an involvement taking into account their respective roles. Okay, I will close to this, but what is obvious that there were policies additionally from this Troika, from the European Central Bank and the Commission and the IMF, that were deeply cutting in the social state, in the welfare states, in particularly in the south of Europe. And actually the president of the European Central Bank said, the social model is long gone. Okay. No, I will finish now with saying that, in fact, it showed that for the countries that were debtors countries, there was like they lost the sovereignty. I mean, we can maybe later speak about what happened in Greece and so on, and at the moment we see that Macron is starting to give an answer and make proposals to go deeper in a reform of the European Union and to democratize this Economic and Monetary Union. But at the same time, we can see that nationally, he's actually doing a policy which is more into the old way of competitive social dumping and lowering standards. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's increasingly rare that I find myself on a panel that includes the title of Democracy, even if it's Crisis, Turkey, and in the contents, and Europe. So it's, thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'll talk about a country that is in a type 1 type of crisis, an acute type of crisis, but perhaps a latently acute a crisis as well, because actually it's been going on for a long time. Yes, Turkey has never been considered a consolidated democracy. It has had always the military looking over, every now and then stepping in. It's been classified as a tutelary democracy, a hybrid regime, illiberal democracy, delegative democracy, and all of that, but nonetheless, some type of a democracy. And despite that, the speed with which it has declined into a very dark type of authoritarianism has been nothing short of baffling. Especially so when you take into account the previous emerging image of Turkey, which was very much promoted also by the Western security establishment, I would say, which, and promoted to the wider region of Turkey's neighborhood as a model of good governance, democratization, and economic growth. But there was some, it wasn't just opportunistic, there were some important and exciting changes happening in Turkey about 10 years ago. It was, or it seemed to be, disassembling the military tutelage that had constrained Turkish democracy for decades. It seemed to be appearing to find a consensus, or at least looking for a consensus for the age-old question of secularism and Islam, how do they go together? So that was a very interesting, exciting, seemingly experiment, taking steps towards the European Union membership and addressing some of its most difficult historical and social issues, including the bloody 40-year-old Kurdish conflict. The picture today couldn't be any more different. The Kurdish war is back on full force, perhaps more violently than it was before in the 1990s. The military is clearly not out of politics, as evidenced by the failed coup attempt of July 2016. Rule of law is all but suspended under a draconian state of emergency, which has seen hundreds of thousands of public officials, military officers, police, judiciary members purged from the state, and thousands of them put in prison alongside journalists, academics, human rights activists. A populist strongman effectively has consolidated power through executive aggrandizement and long-term manipulation of the electoral process. Nancy Bermejo has written about these two as endemic aspects of democratic backsliding in our age. And he's effectively running the country through executive decrees, which the Constitutional Court has declared itself irresponsible for overseeing. We're talking about President Erdogan, who has also recently managed to pass through a very controversial referendum and got accepted a proposal for establishing an executive hyper-presidentialism that may perhaps be compared to the most illiberal examples of Latin America, or perhaps even exceeds it. And speaking of Latin American comparisons, you might remember that not so long ago, Turkey was very much, quite frequently compared to Brazil. Up until the June 2013 protests in both countries, of course. But then it seems like the two countries have diverged their paths. Neither of the country has really gone to a good place, but they've chosen their own crappy paths, it seems. But nowadays, the only comparison you can find Turkey and Brazil is in the list of the most rapidly devaluing currencies. If there is a President Bolsonaro, God forbid, we can go back to some Turkey and Brazil comparisons. In fact, the emerging comparison between Turkey, if there is to be one in Latin America, is that of Venezuela. And it is not just a scholar proposing it. You might also find it in the news. Just last weekend, Nicolas Maduro was on a high-profile state visit to Ankara, where he praised Turkey as a new emerging power in the world, and the two sides talk about this new period of friendship in the years to come. So, how to make sense of such a dramatic descent, which even the Turkish government's most ardent critics couldn't really foresee? I mean, in terms of its dramatic speed and violence, we could say. What was the cause? What were the causes? Was there a massive economic crisis? Well, actually, Turkey's economy has continued to do surprisingly well, even as its democracy deteriorated rapidly. In fact, Jason Brownlee observed in March 2016 that Turkey could be a theory-busting case for the famous theory put forward 20 years ago by Professor Limongi and Adam Jaworski about wealthy democracies not going to dictatorship. And Turkey fulfilled both elements of wealth and democracy for that. I wish Professor Limongi was here, because I would have loved to converse about him with this. Economy matters, but maybe not just GDP per capita. What is it then? Is it resurgent nationalism? Well, nationalism has always been a parcel of Turkey's society and politics. Is it populism? Partly, yes. Erdogan fulfills all the typical stereotypes of the populist leader. But if so, why did it all of a sudden emerge? I mean, Turkey has been governed by the same government ruling party for 15 years. Erdogan was the darling of the West for 10 years. What has changed? And in any case, I tend to think that populism should be seen not only as a cause of our discontents, but as an outcome of our discontents. Is it the mixture of Islamism with neoliberalism, which seems to be the poisonous concoction? Well, 10 years ago, there were analyses praising conservative liberalism of Turkey as the magical mixture. So that existed back then as well. So there needs to be something else to add up, perhaps, to this entire list. And my suggestion in a paper we wrote for this special issue I have with me on Turkey's exit from democracy with a colleague from the University of Graz is focuses on the notion of existential insecurity. Existential insecurity understood as the fear and suspicion of political and physical annihilation of political actors. And I'm not here only talking about an opportunistic use of an insecurity discourse to mobilize the masses, which there is that for sure, but I'm also talking about one that is actually inherently felt by political actors themselves. The belief that in order to survive, you have to dominate or annihilate the other party, and not just electorally, judicially, and perhaps even physically. This goes contrary to the basic democratic idea that democracy is a system where incumbents lose elections, and when they do, they leave office. Because all you lose is your office, and you can contest it in another election. On the contrary, it's an all or nothing mentality that infuses a zero-sum effect into politics, making power sharing or relinquishing power and compromise seemingly suicidal. You cannot take a step back. Therefore, virtually impossible. I would say that a minimum level of existential security is a sine qua non of democracy, alongside elections. You might say that insecurity also existed in Turkey before, didn't it? And it rendered Turkey's institutions, democratic institutions, weak, and justified its authoritarian structures. And this would be correct, with a major difference. In the Cold War environment, we could say that insecurity was managed, contained, in a tutelary democratic setting for the purposes of regime maintenance in a relatively predictable geopolitical environment. Whereas what's happening since, as an aftershock or delayed after effect of the post-Cold War environment, perhaps since the mid to late 2000s, is that insecurity has been exponentially increasing on the basis of overlapping systemic crises on two levels: on the level of the regime, on the domestic level, and on the regional level, which has affected and has basically influenced Turkey and increased insecurity. Let me explain briefly what I mean by these overlapping crises. First one, the domestic level, is the regime crisis. The existence of, since the early 2000s, an increasingly vicious hegemonic struggle for the reins of the state between rival political, social-political actors. A crisis and a struggle to basically change the regime or maintain it. The first phase of it, between 2002 until 2011 perhaps, was between the Kemalists and the Islamists, very roughly. The references involved in this increasingly sort of existential struggle were very historic, going back to the Ottoman sort of era resentments and the foundation of the Republic. It featured attempts of foiled coups already, 2003, 2004, closure attempts for the ruling party, the Justice and Development Party, and a military ultimatum in 2007. And then afterwards, retaliated by the Islamists via two high-level court cases to basically root out Kemalists from state institutions, especially the military. This was, in fact, mistaken or taken at the time as by Turkish liberals, but also by the European Union, as a nasty but a necessary part of a democratization process. Some sort of a birth pang of democracy. You know, it had to happen. In fact, it was killing democracy. In hindsight, we can say that it had little to do with democracy, but with power struggle and survival. The second part of this regime crisis happened once the Kemalists were out of the fray. The military, the secular military was marginalized, and the ruling Islamists, the two constituent parts of the ruling Islamists, Gülenists, if you know them, and Erdogan, fell into each other in an even more vicious manner, featuring high-level corruption cases, even more systemic and deep-running purges. And this process was even more damaging and more paranoia-inducing than the previous regime struggle between the Kemalists and the Islamists, because between the Kemalists and the Islamists, you could tell who was who. They dressed differently, they spoke differently, they came from different backgrounds, they had different ideologies. But the Islamists themselves didn't have these distinctions, so they couldn't know who was with them and who was against them, which led to an incredible increase in paranoia in the state, within the state institutions, leading to a step-by-step decrease into a sort of a type of existential insecurity that was debilitating, for which the 15 July 2016 coup attempt was only a step. So basically, it was a step in this process of a downward spiral. The outcome of this has been a systematic violation of rule of law. For what it's worth, it existed, at least predictability of law existed in Turkey previously. A gradual erosion of the democratic process, a manipulation of the process, institutionalization of extreme paranoia, and extensive purges that reduce state capacity to a debilitating extent. I'm finishing, okay. The consequences of this hegemonic struggle may not have been as damaging had it not been for the simultaneous regional crises, both of which affected Turkey, and both of which had happened in Turkey's own neighborhoods. One, the democratic backsliding in the West, and especially in Europe. I'm talking here about the rise of populist movements in the EU and the loss of EU's normative influence on Turkey, which had acted as some sort of an anchor for liberal democratization. But more directly, the role of the EU in enabling this process of hegemonic struggle to start with the accession process, but leaving it halfway without it being reaching a conclusion. It's as if, like, you know, you start a psychotherapy session, you put apart the patient, and then you leave without putting them back together. And that was the main responsibility of the EU in the case of Turkey. And on the other side, a systemic meltdown, a wildfire taking place in the Middle East, which linked the local existential struggle with a regional and even global one, you know, and deepening it. And you see a deep sort of a real deepening of the existential insecurity after 2013, a sense of betrayal of the government by the West, that they left us and they want to overthrow us. The Gezi protests is a part of a conspiracy in 2013 to overthrow the government. The Egyptian coup against Muslim Brotherhood-led Mohammed Morsi government, a very close ally of the AKP government, the Justice and Development Party government, showed to Turkish government that if they fell, nobody in the West would cry, would shed a tear. And finally, the turnaround in the Syrian war, which was against all expectations of the Turkish government, flooding in of millions of Syrian refugees, and Turkey turning into a jihadi highway. The gains of the Kurdish Syrian Kurds, so on and so forth. All of these factors have contributed to a certain outcome. One person has come out, has emerged as the winner, Erdogan, but has he really won? He's no longer in a position, he is alone at the top of the state hierarchy, but no longer in a position to share power or step back. Any backward step is considered a step towards annihilation. And the proof of it, I would say, and I'm closing here, is the 2015 repeated elections in 2015, when for the first time in 13 years, the governing party lost its parliamentary majority, but refused through a manipulative process of actually acknowledging the results of the elections.
There's been transformations in the British society, and the party must adapt if it wants to win elections. It was an electoral strategy, actually. And it worked. And so, what happened afterwards with a successful electoral strategy? How it's not an invention, it's not a perversion, it's a kind of rational movement trying to adapt the social democracy to what was seen as huge social transformations. For Bettina, I don't know if I got you right, but in the beginning of your presentations, you kind of related increased inequality to non nos representa. This perhaps is so in the United States and Europe. This is not so in Latin America. We are the winners of globalization. If you look the curve, the elephant curve of Branko Milanovic, we are with India more than we are there in las espaldas of the elephant. So how can you think of your argument outside Europe, outside the places where you had increase in inequalities? Of course, inequalities in Latin America were much huger than in Europe and from the beginning. But anyway, the people who went to the streets in São Paulo, they were the winners. The situation had improved. And I think also in Chile, we could say the same. And finally, for Cara, what we are seeing in Turkey and in Venezuela is death produced from the government. From the government. It's not a pressure of the military outside. It's the government producing the debilitating democracy. In Venezuela, I think an important element was an illiberal ideology. The paranoid discourse and all that is there, but fundamentally you have a vision that pluralism is not acceptable. They have, from the beginning, an illiberal ideology. We must stay here because we represent the people and the others are enemies of the people. And then now you have some kind of paranoid discourse also. But I think that the issue is a kind of not liberal ideology. And I would ask you, has this any relations to Islamism or not?
Okay. Any more? Any other question?
First of all, thanks for the presentations. They were truly
Excellent.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I have one quick question for Cara. This idea of the existential threat, which I find very interesting, it seems to me that at some level this is endogenously created, right? The existential threat, I think it's another way of rephrasing Maria Arminia's question. Existential threat emerges because someone with power tells you that they are not going to negotiate with you, and eventually they're going to take over your whatever space you have in terms of power. So that creates existential threat, and of course that triggers a security dilemma, because then you are going to try to preemptively attack, right? And so the question at some level is, so what triggers at some point in time the activation of that existential threat against the other?
Wolfgang, and then.
A quick comment on Maria Hermine, and the comment is it's not related to Milanovic study. It's not that much or not alone. the question of how the globalized wealth is distributed among nations is also very much about the internal distributional structure within society. And at least if it comes to OECD countries, what we have seen during the last 3 decades, it's a clear increase of inequality within the OECD countries. And if this is true, and it is true, it is all OECD studies are showing this, one can relate it to some extent what Jan Werner was talking about the emergence of right-wing populism. And to some extent, this is missing for me. That you warned us at the beginning that you will not talk about that much about causes, what caused the emergence of right-wing populism. But if we talk about a weakness of representative institutions, obviously there was a growing segment of the population, and now I'm talking about the OECD countries, a growing segment of the population which did not, at least subjectively, feel represented. And this weakness of representation certainly has 2 dimensions. The one is the economic exclusion, and the other one is a kind of cultural, discursive exclusion. And this was to some extent driven by the move, the centripetal move of the center-left and center-right catch-all parties. They simply opened political space. And opening political space means that the people who are in these spaces do not feel represented. And so we should be a bit more self-critical, we as cosmopolitan, liberal, multicultural Democrats, that there might be also, this has also be a reaction against, and here this is my last point, against a certain moralistic hegemony in discourses. You were talking about this kind of moral and politics of right-wing populists. But if we look back, what the liberals did, moving away from socioeconomic question in a kind of cultural turn, meaning focusing on identity politics, gender, transsexual, sexual preferences, ethnic minorities, and so forth. And there are good normative reasons for it. But this was liberal identity politics. And now we have a kind of reaction. This is nationalist, populist identity politics. And one has to see the dynamic between the 2 in order to at least provide one piece of explanation.
Yes, please. And I close here. I have a lot of questions myself, but
It's only one question to Professor Miller. Do you think that in the United States specifically, the question of automation of industrial production in states like of the Rusty Belt, which role did it play to the rise of populism? Specifically when, if you look to liberal cities and states, there are jobs, high-paying jobs in different sectors. Did that cause a certain mistrust, disregard between these 2 sides of the society?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I have one of the questions from Maria Hermine, and it's true that the development is opposite, and I want just to remind, because I didn't have the opportunity to show it, but in the European Union, actually we had in Greece, for example, youth unemployment then as a consequence of this crisis mentioned of 67% in 2013, and in Spain was slightly under 65. And these are young people, and very often not uneducated. Often, I mean, when I was working in the parliament, we had stagiaires, unpaid stagiaires that had already done a stage in the United Nations, then the European Parliament, and cannot find a job, and 2 or 3 masters international. Yeah? So they lose like 10 years. It's a lost generation. Only now the economy is going up. So they actually, you mentioned also, part of their existence is really destroyed through these developments. And how I see the development, especially in the 2013 protest movement in Brazil, is much more like a maturation of democracy. Because Brazil was actually number 7 world economic power, was overtaking UK, and was now asked, and actually more people were traveling and could see in other states, rich states, why can't we have an efficient and good public service, hospitals, universities, and so on. And I think they were asking for this, yeah? I mean, I see, and I saw it positive. I didn't feel it threatening, I saw it a positive move. Yeah? And I want to maybe take up also the issue about the socially excluded and the space, the gap that was left to the extreme right. I saw an interesting documentation on ARD, on the German television, on the non-voters and the voters' abstention, which showed a study of University of Osnabrück, where they investigated the probability that wishes or demands of low social groups, so low-income social groups, as compared to middle and high-income groups over the past 15 years. And then the results showed that there's a very low probability that the low social income groups, their wishes are being fulfilled in politics, none regarding which political party was in power, if it was social democratic or conservatives. Yeah? So it means for me that they were not represented, even if they would vote for them, but their wishes were not put on the agenda. And then you have, of course, then a lot of exactly this class that went into the movement of non-voting and then voting more radical. Yeah? And I think it is not surprising that it's actually the Social Democrats that are losing the most in Europe, because they were part of governments that contributed to these liberal policies where there were the losers created, and they didn't take care. So why would you vote for them if they don't do anything for you? Yeah?
Okay, please, Jan.
On Social Democrats. So let me try to give 2 answers at the level of strategy, party politics, and then one more on, again, the level of democratic theory. So on the level of party politics, of course, you're absolutely right that at the time these seem to be smart adaptations to a kind of new world. But first of all, you pay a price when things might change, and you have to re-establish your credibility as a distinct party of the left. And we've seen many cases where social democratic parties have not managed that. Most recently, last month in the German elections. In Britain, it kind of worked, but basically it was somebody fighting with his own party and still fighting with his own party, and basically against the background of an image where it seems like it's an outside movement momentum that is hijacking the party. And I mean, I'm not a consultant, I'm not a PR person for parties, but I think it kind of raises the stakes of what you have to say in terms of re-establishing credibility. If you push me, I would say Social Democrats need the equivalent of the wall in terms of sending a very strong signal of commitment. I'm serious about X. If the German Social Democrats want to win, it's not enough if the leading candidate says it's time for justice. Apparently nobody believes that. If he had said, I'm just making this up, we're going to put somebody from Volkswagen in prison because of what they did, maybe it would have changed the game. I'm just saying. The other thing is simply that, of course, if you adapt in a certain way, you simply reinforce an existing hegemony. So, again, you ultimately are playing into the hands of the other side, which is I think, what can be said vis-a-vis Social Democrats looking back now. But on the level of democratic theory, I think there is a deep problem with a kind of rhetoric that suggests here is a reasonable center and dissent is not truly legitimate. And we're witnessing another experiment in this right now, because Macron's approach is, of course, a second coming of the third way, so to speak. Here is a reasonable center. That's why we can be bipartisan. That's why I can appoint people from the left and the right. Lots of people can be in that center. But whatever is left is disqualified as right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism. And especially if that project is seen to fail in certain ways, I think it's bad news for a democracy as a whole. Back to representation gaps. So I don't disagree with the basic idea that if parties move and then some people feel we're no longer identified with this party, it opens up space for somebody else. What puzzles me, and it's a genuine puzzle, I'm not making a polemical point, is why some of the actors who then fill the gap feel the need to be populists in my sense of anti-pluralists. You could imagine that somebody says, forgive me for being so Euro and especially Germanocentric, the Christian Democrats have abandoned, a truly conservative stance on family policies. They've abandoned nationalism and so on. We now have 7% of people who believe in this stuff very strongly, and they deserve a party to the right of the Christian Democrats. Okay. And people who have already not been voting for several years go back to the polls. It's easy to say in a certain way that's a gain for representation, that's a gain for democracy. But if at the same time the leaders of, let's say, that new imaginary party keep saying, we want our people back, and this whole democracy is a facade, and it's like in the late GDR, and everything is a fraud, and so on, then I think we cannot simply say, oh, it's obviously a gain for democracy, because that kind of rhetoric is, quote-unquote, not normal. So, beyond the banal explanation that some of these people, of course, start out as anti-system because they might really feel there is no place in the system for us anymore, and beyond the banal explanation that once they've succeeded on the basis of these claims, they persist with them, by which I mean that, of course, Marine Le Pen is not going to wake up tomorrow and say, guys, I was just kidding, all the other parties are okay, they fight for their interests, we fight for our interests, I was exaggerating when I said that, UMPS is all the same, and so on. Of course, she's not going to say that for a very banal reason. But I think this is still something that needs to be explained, and that ideally one should also fight. And maybe one way one could fight it, but that's a very theoretical point, I haven't seen this in practice anywhere, but it was kind of recently tried by the Austrian Social Democrats, who basically said, okay, we will not forever exclude a coalition with the official right-wing populists, if you like, but we are going to have a catalog of criteria. So whoever doesn't fulfill these criteria, we cannot have a coalition with. And then if these people don't adapt in certain ways, they also can't complain, and it's more transparent for voters. So it's not so easy to say that, oh, this is a cartel, where the same parties always hold on to the state resources. You can basically give it more of a choice. I mean, it's a very theoretical, pious hope that, this is going to work out. But in theory, I think it could be the right approach, because at one level, it would at least give these populists an incentive to say, look, if you really want to be in a government, here's sort of what you would have to do. If you don't do it, okay, but then don't complain that even though you get the most votes, we are not prepared to kind of do a coalition with you. Last thing, yeah, liberal identity politics. I wish we had 3 more hours to debate this. Frankly, I'm skeptical about the implied trade-off. I don't see why basically advancing the rights of minorities has to come at the expense of something else. And I think empirically the case has not been made that this has recently cost anybody any elections. I mean, all we know about 2016 at this point is that what was reported about Hillary Clinton, the topics that were associated with Hillary Clinton were not, with all due respect, transgender bathrooms. This is a myth that people, the white working class said, I'm not going to vote for her because, she sticks up for these minorities. No, it's because she was associated in terms of topics and what she stood for with email scandals, the foundation, Benghazi, and so on. All this other stuff as topics did not play a real role in that election campaign. So beyond that also, I'm slightly puzzled what it means now to sort of move away from that. So we're not going to protect minority rights now? Or, we'll be more nationalist a little bit, but how exactly? So
this is a This is, Janana, this is a theoretical question you are posing, a normative question. I completely follow you. Right. But why should the lower third of the population think like you? And this is an attack. I don't follow completely your description that they are anti-pluralist. This is, again, an ideal, typical construction of a right-wing populist. They are prepared to coalesce with other parties. They did in 5 or 6 of the West European countries. It's too easy for us just to say they are anti-pluralist. They are for closing the border, but they are accepting basically the rule of the game. This makes them probably more dangerous. They are not outright, as you said, anti-system party. In the Sartorian sense, they are semi-loyal, maybe. And they're moving, indeed, the whole political landscape to the right. Here I agree. Maybe we should look much more specifically into these different countries. At least the right-wing populists in Scandinavia and Switzerland, they are classical reactionary parties mobilizing with populist methods, but they are not anti-system parties.
If I may, just one quick reaction. I mean, it's good to have a debate, obviously. So I agree with you completely that one needs to look at specific national context. I mean, even though on one level what I'm describing sort of ends up looking the same, of course it doesn't mean that it has the same causes. I mean, the reasons for the rise of a Jörg Haider are not the same as the reasons for a rise of a Le Pen or the triumph of Trump and so on. So completely agree that this is always the danger of homogenizing these cases. But also notice one thing, I haven't said anything about the 1/3 of society. I'm making no assumptions about the actual voters. I'm not saying they're anti-pluralists. I'm not saying they're all, oh, what's the word, deplorables. I'm not saying that at all. I think it's a big mistake, both on a strategic but also a normative level, to pretend that we know anything about these people, really. No, who knows? Well, we can find out to some degree, but we cannot, in a sense, morally disqualify these people, partly also because then we do exactly what I'm criticizing populists for. I'm basically saying, oh, because you exclude, we now exclude you in turn. I think it's absolutely the wrong way to go. But I also worry about these sort of views taking hold that, okay, so there's 1/3 of people who basically don't like minority rights. You didn't say that, but I think in the US right now, it's very clear that plenty of Democrats are basically saying, how are we going to reach the moderate Trump voter? And that is clearly code for a strategy of let's go easy on minority rights, let's be a little bit more nationalist, maybe occasionally even a bit of dog whistling, who knows. But this is sort of taken as a factual starting point that everybody has to accept, and it's simply not. Again, purely on the level of strategy, not normative, purely on the level of strategy, as has been shown many times now, if minorities had actually come out for Hillary Clinton, she would have won. If plenty of people in the 3 relevant states would not have voted for a Green candidate, she would have won. It's not obvious that you only can go this one way, and especially it's not obvious that you have to do so on the basis of extremely dubious factual assumptions. So should you do more for the Rust Belt in terms of economic stuff? Of course. Should you now say, oh, there's a trade-off with the liberal identity politics and we have to go easy on minority rights? No. End of campaign speech. Thank you.
Very quickly, I think I could take both your comment and your question together, because with regards to liberalism and Islamism, or populism, let's say, I think the AKP gives a good example of a party that changes its mind, or a movement that changes its mind, doesn't resist and try to beat the system from the outside, but go in and basically change it from within by being open to pluralism and being open to the hierarchy of the system. You know, so I would agree that that is more dangerous, and at least in the Turkish case, it has been proven. The difference between Turkey and Venezuela was that, exactly precisely on that note, was that the project in Turkey didn't start as an illiberal project. But to what extent there was a sort of inherent, a real sort of, at its core, a marriage of liberalism and Islamism, I mean, it seems to have been very superficial. When it comes to the very core of it, it didn't really, it failed the test. So in that sense, Islamism has failed that test of producing a way of offering a better alternative for Turkey in terms of democracy and pluralism and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the triumph of Erdogan, ironically, has been a disaster for Islamism. Not only because he is now associated increasingly with authoritarianism, etc., and all these things, but also because in order to survive, he also had to go against so many Islamists. And so many ideological Islamists are now in prison, are being witch hunted, and Erdogan's closest allies now are hardcore nationalists, they're not Islamists. So Erdogan is an opportunist. So it's not that Islamism has been a monolithic idea from the beginning and is still there as such. It's very malleable. And I had one more question, very quickly. What triggers existential threats? I think it's a chicken and egg question a little bit. I don't think we can really come to the root of it, because when you listen to the discourse, there's always a precedent, a previous incident that caused the resentment. I mean, we're talking about, in the Turkish case, going back to the 18th, 19th century of Ottoman era reformation and all that. But more importantly, we can talk about what can end it. And I think there are, here there's, and this is perhaps the hope aspect of it, there is a choice at times, at critical junctures, that political actors have to make, whether they will take a risk and actually try to reach out, and perhaps they will get out of that vicious cycle of existential spiraling insecurity, or they will push further and go on for annihilation. Turkey went through this twice in recent years. First one was the 2013 protests. There were voices within the government saying that reach out to the other side. And it will heal our differences. Erdogan chose not to. And then the 2015 election where he lost the majority. And then, and when you close one door after another, you end up not having any doors anymore. You just have a wall, and there you can't do anything. And at this moment, I think we're at that stage where probably it's going to be very difficult for Erdogan or anybody else to reach out to make a new sort of compromise and cohabitation.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent panel. We overstepped the break. I'm sorry, but it was really, I congratulate all of you. Thank you.
In terms of resentments and so on, you could tell that story about many countries, Bulgaria, existential insanity, Hungary, the Sea of Slavs, whatever. And the question is, so what really allows the potential that there to be active?
I think the intensity of perhaps, well, I mean, perhaps we could look at two things: institutional strength, in that sense, EU countries within the EU, from those countries outside of the EU, Hungary, Bulgaria. And secondly, the geopolitical meltdown in the Middle East. I mean, the effect of that in Turkish society has been incredible. So, I mean, I think there are certain contingent elements that are not necessarily generalizable, but regionally sort of specific.
But because you said they would be different from each other, I was like surprised how you managed to make peace again with Putin, because that was also like that. So how did they reconcile? Because that was also so confrontational.
When he realized that he can no longer go with the Americans, he needed to. We have
So he did it, or who did it?
in our history, we have the case of Turkey, the Ottoman history, when the government, the Sultan, was attacked from the government of Egypt. He appealed to the Russian Tsar for help. And there's a phrase, when you're drowned, you look for a snake to hold on to. So in a sense, it was almost like a last resort.
So he came to
When you're drowning, right,
and hold on to the snake.
and there's a snake you hold on to. It sounds better. The truth is that some people use never been able to offend Putin. can happen, but it's a real sort of trust and almost a social contract, you know? Bring together different parts of communities and say that let's go exist.
But like, wouldn't it be when there's a successor president?
Well, that's another issue, but what I'm talking about is bringing Erdogan's political career. He seems to have really backed himself out of any of those. I mean, some of his own, he's trying to actually come out of it by making reforms and changes within the party. Let's see what can happen. He's made so many enemies. He's also basically the Putin liberal. I mean, he's going to have to die in office. Yeah, for sure. What's difficult for him is that Turkey is not a rentier state, and there is a bigger opposition in Turkey to the government than it is. So it goes for an unconsolidating weak authoritarian state. Actually, we have here a comparison of Russia and Turkey, state capacity. Turkey, exit from democracy, liberal governance in Turkey. What time should we do?
Yeah, I think we can live together. If we take first the metro or something, sometimes it's better than to go through even if we take
activist or process report until after your election. Very serious. So in that sense, that infuriated Turkey's sort of social liberals, social democrats. You've really thrown us in the trash.
Congressional House.
No,
That is either the Senate or the House of Representatives. Then ratify the decision and take the parliamentarian away. So it was like a wrestle between the Senate and the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, we can take it.
I saw you.
They are the ones that need to get the denunciation accepted by the first. Otherwise, the process can go on. The lawsuit will go on. You cannot strip the parliamentarian from his standing without saying that he will not be one of us anymore, and so you can arrest him. This was
just motivation to Thomas. Thank you so much. This conversation is very hard for you.
Okay, so I think that this senator is temporary negotiations.
Lawyers think
It's nice to come to
like that. Sociologists and political scientists are not good research. I feel like, it goes down to the
Latin America. Yeah.
Okay. We're ready to start with the last panel. If we can call everyone to attention. We're ready. Okay, so welcome to the last panel of the afternoon on variants and causes of crisis Latin America. We have two speakers, Aníbal Pérez Linan and Juliano Zaiden Benvindo. And so we're going to open with their comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. Aníbal?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that it's a pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to be in this place and in this conference. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's really fantastic. What I am going to present today is part of some work that we have been doing with John Polgat, the U.S. Naval Academy, on the factors that drive the outcomes of presidential crises in Latin America. And so, to begin, let me point out that if you look at Latin America since World War II, there has been a consistent period of political instability in most countries, in which depending on how you count, but about 40 democratic presidents, I'm not talking about authoritarian presidents, but about 40 democratic presidents were ousted from power in Latin America since World War II. What, of course, it's different has changed over time is that if you look at the ways in which those presidents have been ousted from power since World War II, the patterns of the mechanisms by which they have been removed from office have changed. So what you are seeing here is just a timeline in the horizontal axis, and in the vertical axis is you see the probability that presidents in Latin America will be removed from office in one of two ways. One, the red line, the red dotted line, is a military coup, a military intervention, and the blue line is some form of legal mechanism to remove the president, the elected president, from office. And by legal, I mean mechanisms that can be constitutionally ambiguous, like an impeachment, which can be, of course, they are always questioned in one way or another, or a declaration of presidential incapacity by Congress, or simply protests in the streets that force presidents to resign. So all of those mechanisms are technically legal, but of course, they tend to be highly contested. What is clear in this graph, and this is not news, is that over time, the risk of a military coup has declined, and it clearly declined after the end of the Cold War. But there has been this substitution effect by which presidents are now being removed by these legal mechanisms. So we are in a period in which governments continue to be unstable in Latin America, but the democratic regimes are more or less stable because there is no military intervention. Now, this opens two important questions, I think. One is, there has been, of course, a large literature in Latin America about the causes of military coups. There has been a more recent literature about the causes of impeachments. But there are two questions that are interesting when we put the two problems, the two mechanisms together. One is, it seems that impeachments are kind of functional equivalents for old-fashioned military coups. So if that's true, one important question is, are there common causes for the two phenomena? That is, are there common factors that drive both the removal of presidents, both in legal or in illegal ways? That's one question. And the second question that is immediately related to that is, if there are those common factors, then what are the causes that separate those outcomes? Why is it that in the past we had coups and now we have impeachments in a legal way? So this is the kind of, these two questions are questions that we address recently in a paper that was published this year with John Polga. And we essentially identify some conditions that tend to separate, some historical conditions that tend to separate those two outcomes. So, of course, the regional context matters a lot, and this is crucial for the effects of the Cold War. So when we observe a historical period in which there are military coups going on in many countries, then it's more likely that we will see a military coup as opposed to an impeachment in any particular country. So the regional environment matters a lot. The presence of a strong legislative shield, and by that I mean the fact that the president has very strong support from his or her own party in Congress, or sometimes a strong coalition, really makes a difference in the sense that it's not relevant to explain military coups, but it certainly reduces the risk of an impeachment. So that's one of the factors that separates, that prevents one of the possible outcomes and therefore separates the outcomes over time. And lastly, we find that support for democracy among political elites is crucial. And again, this is central to understand the historical transformation that we see in this figure. And this is not surprising, when elites are more committed to democracy, then they will be unwilling to support a military coup, but they may be willing to support an impeachment if they think that that the president has committed a crime. So those variables tend to separate the two outcomes and explain the differences in patterns over time to a great extent. But we also find that there are some factors in common, factors that destabilize presidentialism, irrespective of the outcome and the mechanism by which the president is ultimately removed from office. Among those common factors are economic recessions. Economic recessions tend to destabilize governments. This is not surprising. In all times, irrespective of the outcome. Mass protests tend to destabilize governments, of course. And we have seen that in Brazil, of course, recently. And the third factor that destabilizes governments is what we call radicalism. And this is the factor I want to emphasize today, and is the aspect that we emphasize in the paper I am presenting today. So the paper I am presenting today builds on this finding of this previous paper that essentially shows that when we have radical elites in the system, and I am going to define this term in a minute, when we have radical elites, governments tend to be more unstable and presidents are more likely to fall through military coups or through impeachments, depending on the historical period. So the topic I want to explore today is the effects of radicalization. So first of all, by radicalism, I do not mean that political leaders or political parties are on the extreme left of the political spectrum. What I mean by radicalism, this is a term that we developed in a previous book with Scott Mainwaring, And what we mean by radicalism is the position that political actors have, political parties, political leaders, trade unions, and so on, the positions that they have with respect to public policies. And by radicalism, we mean that those actors tend to adopt, actors that we consider radical, adopt positions that are, they tend to be extreme. This is the point I want to discuss today. In the analysis that we did with Polga, we just looked at the general presence of radical actors in the system, and we found that this destabilizes the presidents. However, in the previous work with Scott Mainwaring that I mentioned before, where we defined this idea of radicalism, we found that for political regimes, radical actors in government or in opposition may have different effects. For example, in the case of transitions to democracy, radical governments, radical authoritarian rulers delay any form of transition to democracy because they are unwilling to negotiate any liberalization of the system. But radical oppositions, because they tend to destabilize the authoritarian regime, quite often facilitate the transition to democracy, even if they may be pro-democratic or not, but that's a different issue. So what we are doing in this paper with Paul is wondering, well, if radical actors in government and opposition have different impact on political regimes, they may have perhaps different impacts for presidential crises. So we essentially developed two hypotheses. The first one is that when radical actors are in the opposition, they will tend to destabilize presidents in any way possible, depending on the historical context in which they operate. So radical oppositions will use coups when military coups are viable, or they will call for impeachment in historical periods when impeachments are viable. The fundamental insight here is that radical oppositions tend to be semi-loyal oppositions quite often, because if the president, if the government adopts a policy that they consider unacceptable, they will see the government as illegitimate. And because they see the government as illegitimate, they will try to find ways to destabilize the incumbent. So in different historical periods, they will use whatever instruments seem to be more effective for that purpose. In the 1950s and 1960s, they quite often formed a coalition with the military. Now that, given the international context, that's harder to do. So quite often they will call for impeachment, or they will try to force, they will mobilize protests to force the resignation of the president. Now, so this is kind of intuitive and straightforward. Now, the more interesting issue, I think, is what happens when the government is radicalized, when presidents are the radical actors. And what we anticipate in this case is that when presidents are radical actors, then if they fall, they are more likely to fall as victims of a military coup. The insight here is that radical presidents want to impose their policies at any cost, even if they confront opposition in institutions, in the judiciary, in Congress, in public opinion, and so on. And because they have these radical preferences for adopting their policies, they usually engage in what Nancy Bermeo calls executive aggrandizement. They will try to build up the power of the executive branch in order to gain control over, to bypass Congress, to gain control over the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And so what this means is that the natural spaces for the opposition to funnel their discontent and their resistance, going back to the discussion about Turkey before, those spaces narrow down. And so any attempt to challenge the president using constitutional mechanisms like impeachment or even street protests becomes much more unlikely to be feasible to begin with. And when it happens, it's very, very unlikely to succeed because presidents gain control over multiple political spaces. And so what that happens is that triggers a reaction from the opposition, a strategic reaction from the opposition by which the moderate actors are kind of disempowered, and this is what Linz famously described as the abdication of the moderates, which sometimes they do not abdicate, they're just disempowered. And then that means that the more radical actors operating against the president will often try some extreme measures, like a military coup to overthrow the government. Those coups quite often fail. So they failed in Venezuela in 2002. They failed in Turkey in 2016. But sometimes they are successful, right? The coup was successful in Egypt in 2013, for example. So if we have radical presidents, the anticipation is that if they are displaced from power, they will be more likely to be displaced from power through military action. Now, there are, of course, alternative explanations for why coups or impeachments happen. There is the issue of institutions, right, that I mentioned before, whether the president has protection in Congress to prevent an impeachment or not. Protests are a factor destabilizing governments that can play in favor of coups or in favor of impeachments. There are, of course, legacies in the sense that there are arguments about the countries with a past history of coups being more likely to have coups, for example. There is regional diffusion that I discussed before in the sense that if there are many coups in the region, it's more likely for a country to have a military coup. And of course, economic conditions like recession destabilize governments and create the conditions for impeachment or military action. So there are multiple alternative explanations that we need to keep in mind. So to test our two hypotheses, essentially what we do is we look at democratic years in Latin America in 19 countries between 1945 and 2010, and that's slightly over 700 observations, country years. And we model the risk of a president being ousted from power through a military coup or through an impeachment or some other form of legal removal as competing risks models. That is essentially we are having survival models in which presidents can be removed from office in one way or another. If they complete their terms or if they survive in any given year, they are treated as censor cases. So we have a model in which a regular competing risks model, which is essentially like a multinomial logit, and then we have a model in which we have random effects, conditional frailties. And the dependent variable is trichotomous. The president may survive at the end of the year. He or she may be removed through a coup, or he or she may be removed through a legal mechanism. The main variable that we have, the main two variables that we have are the two variables that capture the degree of radicalization among government, the president and his or her allies, and the opposition. And those measures come from my previous work with Scott Mainwaring. Essentially what we did was we hired about 20 research assistants, and we asked them to read the historical literature about each country for different periods, for different historical periods, to identify the main political actors that emerged from that historical literature, and essentially to use a protocol to identify if those political actors had extreme policy positions in terms of the policy space at the time, and if they showed signals of being intransigent or intolerant. And I can give you more details about the operationalization of this later. So essentially we capture the average position of the proportion of radical actors among government actors and among opposition actors. And those are the two main variables in the analysis. Then we have variables that capture legislative support, the president's party or coalition share in Congress, levels of social protests, riots, and demonstrations against the government, legacy variables that essentially capture the number of military coups and the number of impeachments over the past 20 years in each country, the international context, the regional context, which captures the number of coups and the number of impeachments in the region, in other countries in the region over the past 5 years, economic conditions, levels of economic development and growth, and then a time variable to correct for changes in the baseline risk over time. Just to move quickly into the results. What you are seeing here is, I will not torture you too much with the coefficients in the table, but what you are seeing here is the coefficient for the two main variables, government radicalism and opposition radicalism, for two models. The model 3.1 is the model that shows competing risks, and the second model is with frailties. The two models are essentially capturing the same, which is the effect of the variables on the probability of legal removal and the effect of the variables on the probability of a military coup. And as you can see, government radicalism is a separating variable in the sense that when the government is radicalized, the risk of legal removal doesn't change. If anything, it goes down, but this effect is not statistically significant. But the risk of a military coup increases in both models. So this means that radical governments, if they are removed from office, they're more likely to be removed by a military coup. By contrast, opposition radicalism tends to increase both the chances of a legal removal from office and of a military coup. Radicalized oppositions tend to remove the president from office using whatever means they have at their disposal. There are other variables in the model, and I will not get into many details, that also work as separating or common explanations. So the two separating explanations in blue are the president's party share of seats in Congress. So if the president's party is very strong in Congress, and impeachment is very unlikely, is less likely, and so this is quite clear. And the second factor that separates the outcomes over time, as I said before, is the presence of military coups in the region. If we have a period in which many countries are experiencing military coups in the region, it's more likely that the country in particular will experience a military coup, and less likely that we'll experience an impeachment. The two factors that tend to be common causes, as I had mentioned before, are demonstrations. Demonstrations against the government tend to increase both the risk of impeachments and military coups, and economic recession with very low levels of economic growth, with negative economic growth. Both legal mechanisms to remove the president and military coups tend to be more likely. Just to give you a sense of what this means in terms of concrete risks, and to conclude, what we are seeing here is two plots which show the predicted probability, the predicted risk of a legal removal from office, or the predicted risk of a military coup based on the models that I showed you before. And what you have in the horizontal axis in both panels is the number of demonstrations against the government in any given year. So the predicted values here essentially show you that as demonstrations increase, the risk of a legal removal will increase through impeachment, for example, but also the risk of a military coup will increase. Now, in the two panels, in the two simulations that I am showing here, we are assuming, for the sake of the simulation, that all political actors, government and opposition, are moderate actors. So demonstrations increase the risk of presidential instability in any of both types, but the risk remains relatively low. Now, if we now do the same simulation, but assuming that the opposition is radical, the government is moderate, but the opposition is radical, what we observe is that the predicted probabilities, the risk of a legal removal still goes up with more protests against the government, when people are unhappy against the government. But the risk of coup also goes up in a much more clear way, which means that radicalized oppositions are willing to use military coups, if necessary, to satisfy the demand, the popular demand, to get rid of the government. The more interesting difference, however, takes place when we consider that not only the opposition is radicalized, but also the government is radicalized. And this is the third set of graphs. When you look at this set of graphs, when all actors are radical, now more demonstrations tend to increase the risk of a legal removal through impeachment. And this is similar to the first graph, however. But what really increases now is the risk of a military coup. So when the government is radicalized, it seems that the government is closing down opportunities for an impeachment and is therefore forcing the opposition, the radicalized opposition, to use the military coup as the most likely mechanism. To conclude then, we need to develop, and we are starting to see theories that treat military coups and impeachments together as part of the same theory. So we need theories that explain the resolution of democratic crises through constitutionally ambiguous mechanisms like impeachment and unambiguous mechanisms like military coups. It's clear that those theories need to give us an explanation for why those outcomes happen differently in different historical periods. Clearly, the regional context is an explanation for why those factors are separated in different periods, and the capacity of presidents to build a legislative shield helps explain why sometimes impeachment do not happen, and the only resolution, if the president is going to be ousted, would be a military intervention. Also, we need to identify common causes. In particular, economic recession seems to destabilize governments in general, and mass protests seem to destabilize the governments in general. But what we are finding in this particular work that is novel is that government radicalism operates as a separating mechanism. When governments are radicalized because they engage in executive aggrandizement, a civilian outcome, an impeachment, is much less likely, and the opposition is forced to use a military venue if they want to overthrow the government. By contrast, opposition radicalism is a common cause. Radical oppositions tend to destabilize governments in any way possible. So the conclusion I want to emphasize is that to understand some of the outcomes that we are observing for crisis of democracy nowadays, it's very important to understand contextual factors like the economy and the international context, but we also need more sensible theories about the role of political actors and their policy preferences. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate here in this such a great panel. And I'm very, I always say it's a different environment when I'm a lawyer actually not actually a political scientist. So sometimes it's intimidating to be among political scientists because usually lawyers are much more normative when they explain the phenomena of our reality than the political science, who are much more empirical and bring in different perspectives about the political phenomenon. Well, anyway, my talk today, the title is quite, I know, general. I can say it's just conceptual constitutional change in Latin America. And I come to this title because last year, especially because of the impeachment process here in Brazil, I usually every other month I write it to iConnect, which is the blog of International Journal of Constitutional Law. And something that struck me as quite interesting there is that how fast was the idea of impeachment changing at that time. So. And actually, it's a kind of a concept which is very complex, and there was just discussion whether it was legitimate or not. And focus on that, I just saw that maybe the speed how things change and the concepts of that are usually used in constitutional law maybe I don't know, maybe we should see whether they've really changed or not over the years. So the idea here was first to see, oh, sorry, of course, to see whether we can develop a kind of a framework of how these changes are taking place somehow, especially concepts which are very connected to Latin American developments recently. So, and for that I use first Reinhard Koselleck, who's a very famous German historian. He has this book Begriffsgeschichte, which is a very famous one, and he examines how concepts change over history. So the idea here is he has the idea of temporality is multi-leveled and is continuously being accelerated and decelerated at distinct speeds. Concepts should thereby be explored in their key meanings in distinct historical periods. History is a very important thing, is that it's very complicated to examine the change of a concept in a very short period of time, of course. So especially the impeachment of the last year and the other aspects, of course, other concepts, I cannot, of course, bring a serious analysis of how it has changed over the years in a short period of time. But I can maybe examine a more maybe a broader period and see whether they've changed or not. So based on that, and I just some other aspects like history is marked by conflicting rights and interests among social groups leading to distinct, interpretation of the reality. History also depends on the resource of those who will tell the life story, history. And history is above all its course, and as such evolves with language. This somehow, okay, of course there are some aspects which are quite obvious here. But anyway, I think it's important to mention that there's a very interesting theoretical background on how concepts change over the history, and I especially based my perspective on Reinhard Koselleck. I'm just struggling here with both my computer and data show. But why Latin America? So change and stability in Latin America. First, we know that Latin America is a region rich of constitutional experiences, political stabilities, and continuous struggle between development and social inequality. The second thing is many Latin American countries had a little or no democratic experience before 1990. So democratizing pressure became more evident. Third, transitions from dictatorships to democracies gained momentum in different Latin American countries from the 1980s onwards. So Latin America has more than 200 years of constitutionalism. It's an important aspect to mention. But even though it has a long history of constitutionalism, it has a very little period, short period in history of democratic moments. And based on that, I focus on some concepts which are normally associated with Latin America and the history. One of them is hyper-presidentialism. So we have a very famous Argentine scholar, Roberto Gargarella, who published quite recently a book on Latin American constitutionalism. And his main thesis is that Latin American is, maybe the stability of Latin America is based on this hyper-presidentialism, which is quite a controversial statement. Of course, it's not that. There are a lot of other scholars who say that it's the presidentialism is a point, but it's not that determinant of how Latin America has been so unstable. Another concept which has other aspects which might be interesting is that long-standing centralizing tradition. Latin America, we know, of course, especially the Constitution of the 19th century, they were very inspired by the American model, but they in a very particular way, and they've changed a lot from that. So it's interesting how different they are nowadays in comparison to what they were at that time. But one aspect that maybe connects all the countries that they have a long centralized tradition. Institutional weakness. Yes, this is something that might be important. Of course, this is normally very well portrayed in many political science, that in Latin America there is a lot of institutional weakness, but it's also something that, especially from some years ago, ago to today, we can say that some countries in Latin America, not all countries, but some countries in Latin America have developed better and much better institutional systems, frameworks. Focus on social rights is something very important. Most of the constitutions in Latin America, they have a strong focus on social rights, which doesn't mean that social rights are really respected here, but this is something that is very normal, which is quite interesting. There's a very interesting empirical study by David Law from the Washington University at St. Louis, and he says, he quite clearly shows how social rights usually are much stronger in constitutions which don't, in constitutions from countries which don't respect social rights in reality. So there's a kind of a contradiction in between text and reality. And the other thing, constitution making strongly based on compromise and bargains leading to international contradictions, inability to deal with the worst case scenario. This is of course a normal procedure in many countries where you have this transition to democracy. It's not on something particular in Latin America. But anyway, the thing is, the process of constitution making in Latin America is much more, many scholars say, and especially in Latin America, the scholars who wrote pieces, the political science in 1990, Francis Hogopian and Schmitter and a lot of other, this idea of we had a lot of bargains and the future of Latin America is kind of doomed to failure. Okay, so this is the idea, the similarities I just changed a little bit and something new, sorry, it's not going, okay. Wow, what's going on here? Okay. One thing that might interest, just to contradict that first impression, is that executives' strong lawmaking powers, this is something that really happened. There's an empirical analysis by Elkins, Ginsburg, and Scheibel. They say, yes, the constitution in the last years in Latin America, they got much stronger lawmaking powers. But on the other hand, this is not necessarily bad. So sometimes it can be really good. And there's this idea that presidents can be bad. For example, like Gagarella mentioned, this is not actually empirically necessarily true. So this is an idea which, okay, we had stronger lawmaking powers. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. The process of democratization in the region, of course, it makes, if you look from the political science from the 1980s and 1990s, and you see what happened in the Latin American overall, we're going to see that's, that prediction that we would be so bad nowadays. Okay, they had a point there, but I think the development of Latin America overall was much better than actually portrayed by those scholars in the 1990s. So there's something important here because the process of democratization, and we can see most of the countries in Latin America, they had a kind of process of democratization which is now, in most of the countries, you don't see dictatorships anymore. One thing that's quite important here, just to mention, is that usually Latin America is portrayed by lawyers, constitutional lawyers, as if we had a homogeneous constitutional system, which is totally wrong. I'm writing right now a piece on constitutional amendment, constitutional replacements in Latin America. It's impressive how different the constitutional designs and constitutional frameworks in Latin America are. You cannot, for example, compare the 1853 constitution in Argentina, which was revised in 1994, with our constitution in Brazil. It's totally different framework. And if you go just Chile and Paraguay, or Uruguay, you're going to see that their framework are very different one from the other. So it's quite wrong to say we have a similar system of constitutional design, which normally is portrayed by many scholars. And this is, I've made this revision of the literature. And if you go look at the constitutions specifically, you're going to see their designs are very, very, of course, there are a lot of connections, but they are not as similar as normally portrayed by the scholarship. And one thing that's quite important to mention is also the judicial review. Judicial review, you normally think of Latin American, or actually there's a global trend of judicial review in the world. So we think of Supreme Courts as the new maybe guardian of constitutionalism and democracy. And actually, when we look at Latin America specifically, we're going to see that this is not totally true. We have some countries, of course, that we have this rising role of Supreme Courts like Brazil, like Chile. But other countries, you don't see Supreme Courts making any role. For example, in Mexico, for example, it's very, very tiny. In 2011, they had something there, but it's not compared to what we have, for example, here. There might be something related to the PRI, which is in the power for more than 80 years there. And even in other countries, even in Argentina, for example, you can see how the Supreme Court worked there. I think you cannot compare for how, for example, the Supreme Court here in Brazil or maybe in Chile or Costa Rica or in other countries. So there are things that are just, okay, sorry. There are many aspects here to mention how conflicting views of Latin America maybe play a role. So based on this crazy ideas, I've focused on some concepts which can be drawn from these realities and just to see whether we can see how they've changed. So we see Latin America is a very controversial paradigm, usually depicted as a common reality. But of course, when you see how controversial it is, it also affects how we see these concepts over history. For one of them, the first one is populism. And here, one aspect which I think is quite important is to see, for example, if there is any difference between populism in the north and populism in the south. So whether what do we call populism in both regions? So this is something that you normally can say. Maybe you say there's in the north immigration is a problem, which is not a problem normally when you say populism here. What can make this difference? And the different populism in the history, like populism in the past and populism nowadays, like Chavez, Morales, and old populism, Vargas, Perón in Latin America. So what kind of populism we can take from these realities, whether we can make some connection among them. The other perspective is revolution. Revolution is also a concept which is very complex, of course. We cannot say revolution quite easily. And it's interesting, for example, revolution is something that our military dictatorship uses a lot as something related, or maybe like a very beautiful concept to explain the authoritarian regime. And if you look, for example, in Chile, they didn't like it in some parts to say we have a revolution here. So the dictatorships, they manage the concept of revolution in very different ways in Latin America. So this is the idea I focus somehow, revolution and dictatorships, and revolution and also constitutional change. There's something very particular, for example, how Mexico analyzed the idea of revolution. If you look at the Mexican constitution, for example, they prohibit rebellion in the constitution. This is quite weird because you have a constitution, the 1917 constitution in Mexico, and it's stated there that rebellion is against the constitution and even can be a criminal offense, which is quite weird. And what's interesting, because the former constitution also had that same clause. But when it just was replaced in the 1917, they kept this. So the idea of revolution against constitutionalism, or but actually it became the Constitution of 1917 was the result of a revolution. So it's quite a crazy. And the other idea is revolution and populism, which is somehow related to the idea of a Bolivarian revolution, which we have right now in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and Ecuador somehow. I haven't quite finished political. I'll just go to the other one, which is quite some other. Just sorry, I'll go directly here to presidentialism, which is quite important, I think. Just oh my gosh, I'm just a sec. So that's what I meant before, the idea whether presidentialism, which is actually presidentialism, hyper-presidentialism and political instability, and you can make this idea, for example, the impeachment, whether this plays a role. And we have, for example, in a few months ago here in Brazil, the idea of semi-parliamentarism, presidentialism, and political stability. How can we, what's actually presidentialism over the history in Latin America? Because one thing that is quite interesting is that this idea of hyper-presidentialism, which, for example, Garella mentions a lot in his book. If you look at how the presidential systems are designed in Latin America, they're actually not so homogeneous as are normally depicted. So this is something, of course, when you look at the history of Latin America, we cannot actually make a common point here as if there was like one only presidentialism. And just something more related to the law, the idea of constitutional formal change, which means constitutional amendment and constitutional replacement. And this is something quite important because we normally see the idea of how to formally change the constitution. We usually think of amendments and constitutional revisions or constitutional replacements. But nowadays, even the concept of constitutional amendments might not be that relevant as yesterday. So one concept which is very important, and a good friend of mine has written on it, is the idea of constitutional dismemberment. Nowadays, we can, of course, have constitutional amendments. In Brazil is one of the, I can say, winners in constitutional amendment in the world. It amends the constitution every three times every year. It's along with Mexico and India, the country where you have more amendments in the world. But the thing is, constitutional amendment, this concept which has been the traditional system of change the constitution, is being used in a new perspective, which is not actually to change something in the constitution, but actually to change the core of the constitution. So something more radical. So you use the system of the constitution, so the procedure of constitutional amendment to change radically the constitution. The question is whether this is legitimate or not. Well, if you can change something that is so radical in the Constitution through the rules of the game. So you play by the rules. So you go to the rules of you play by the rules of the game, but you make such a radical change to the Constitution that it might be much more than actually a constitutional amendment. It's just more. It's like, and this is the concept that Richard Albert brings. It's a constitutional dismemberment, and an example that is quite recently here in Brazil is, for example, that constitutional amendment that radically which frees the annual expenditure on social rights and other aspects, because especially if you look at the Constitution, which is very socially oriented, and now we have this cap on spending, this of course might be interpreted as a kind of constitutional dismemberment as long as it really kind of prohibits some spending on social rights. And one thing that's important to mention is, I mentioned before, is the idea of constitutional informal change. And here in particular, judicial review in Latin American history. We normally have this beautiful idea, nowadays actually not that beautiful as before, of judicial review being this guardian, and this is something I think it's quite important to mention, how over the history, judicial review in Latin America is much more kind of a preservationist strategy of political elites than actually something that is make some progress towards social rights. So judicial review, and of course the differences in different countries in Latin America. So the concept of judicial review is very radically different among the countries in Latin America, and especially over history. Even Brazil, for example, which is something most of you are more aware of how it has developed. We understand judicial review as it is today from maybe 2000 onwards, but not before. No one knew the names of the justices of the Supreme Court. Today, everyone knows the name of Supreme Courts. And this is something very particular because of the idea of judicial review has changed very strongly over the years. So we think judicial review as something natural of the democracy in Brazil right now, and we did not. Especially if you look at the Supreme Court, right after the Constitutional Assembly in Brazil, it was the same Supreme Court of the dictatorship. It didn't change at all. And now it became something so important to Brazil. And in other countries, something quite similar happened. In other countries, it didn't happen at all. So judicial review, which is something very important, a concept for democracy for some, it's not such important concept for many other countries in Latin America. Actually, it doesn't matter. for some country, whether there's judicial review or not. So, and one important maybe theory here is how whether the fragmented political system plays a role in how judicial review is actually whether judicial review is strong or weak as a mechanism of defense of the political of the democracy. It's judicial review and political fragmentation is just what I mentioned. So and strong and weak judicial review, it's the final argument. So these are the main, just some concepts I've been working on. So of course this is a very working paper right now, but the idea is just to focus on some concepts which have played a role in Latin America and see whether they've changed over the years, how empirically they maybe not as homogeneous as normally depicted by the scholarship. And this is something important which I think, especially from maybe a constitutional perspective, and what makes so important to be here like, among political scientists is that when we lawyers normally examine the political concepts like, for example, the idea of presidentialism, and when we are confronted by how, especially the political scientists examine this concept, it's impressive how different this is. So even the idea of presidentialism, for example, which is Gagarello is a lawyer, and you just see how the political scientists discuss this topic. We see how maybe this disconnection with reality and all these differences are here normally presented. So, well. This is some some you know, crazy ideas. I've been writing on this, and this is my page on necessary. And if anyone wants to have other comments, I'm more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anibal and Giuliano. We're going to open the floor to questions and comments, and I think we'll take maybe 3. And then we'll loop back to the panel.
I have a question to and for Anibal, and I want to ask you about some patterns of reasons why impeachments were initiated. Did you find out that there are certain causes, reasons like corruption or bending the constitutions, with which causes they initiated impeachments? And can you say something under which conditions these impeachments were successful and when they failed? And the very last, also a pattern question. Did these impeachment more solve crisis situation or did they create them?
Yeah. Anibal, does radicalism from the left or from the right have different consequences? Did you test for this? Either in government and in the opposition? And for Giuliano, what accounts for the diversity of constitutional design in Latin America? Are there different traditions? Why this diversity?
My name is Luis. I'm a reporter from o Estado de São Paulo. I would like to ask Anibal if would you characterize Venezuelan opposition as a radical actor, and why the military are still loyal to Maduro in a scenario that, as you described, would lead to a coup?
Okay, so maybe we'll start with those 3 questions, and then we'll open again.
I have to go.
Okay.
For a minute. So,
okay.
Thank you for both presentations that were very rich and very interesting and very provocative. I have a question for Anibal. I think you ended the presentation with a very good question. Well, very important for at least to the way I see the question that you mentioned. That is, we need to know more, to have more knowledge about how political actors act. And then you mentioned also that the necessity of going on in the context in which they take choices like moderation or radicalism. Yeah, and you mentioned the economic conditions and the international environments. What I would like to know is how do you think the internal, local conditions, and also which are in some Latin American cases very important, the institutional crisis that in a sense creates the conditions and the environment in which either you have mass demonstrations or you have the change of positions of some actors, some of them that usually have behaved in a very democratic way and then they change, or in the other way now. So I just would like to whether you could exploit more this dimension. Thank you.
Should I start? Yes. Okay. Thank you for the great questions. There are many questions, so please just interrupt me. If I forget something, interrupt me. Regarding your question, impeachment is it's kind of this strange animal that is half political and half legal, right? So it looks at some level like a vote of no confidence because Congress is deciding, but it's required to show that there is some crime that has been committed. And constitutions define this in different ways. Some of them are more flexible than others, but in the end, there is always some justification based on either corruption or abuse of power, right, in all cases. Where those justifications are legitimate or they are fabricated by the opposition or the media, that's always a matter of contention, right? Depending on the cases, it's more obvious that are fabricated than others, but that issue is always contested. But there is always either corruption or abuse of power at the foundation of an impeachment. Now, there are many cases in which there is corruption or abuse of power demonstrated and the president suffers no impeachment at all, right? So for impeachment to be successful, I think that at least three things need to be present. The first one is there has to be, and this goes back to my paper, there has to be a context in which military intervention is unlikely because otherwise the military will just step in and do the job, right? But more importantly, in the contemporary context, I think the two critical issues are there has to be mass mobilization, public outrage against the president, which sends signals to the members of Congress that the president has no support, and so even some former allies may be willing to defect. And the second issue is that, and that's kind of the ultimate barrier to prevent impeachment, is what I called in the presentation a legislative shield, the fact that the president either has a party that is divided, or it has a party that is too small, or it has a coalition that broke down, as in the case of Dilma. So when those three elements combine, then it's very likely that the president will be doomed. Now, whether that closes the crisis or not, there is a debate about that. Leif Marstentredet from the University of Oslo has argued that, and I think this argument is very sensible, that when presidents are impeached because there is proven corruption, then the impeachment closes the problem, right? So people have a sense of relief, and so the crisis is averted. But when impeachments happen as an excuse to get rid of a president in a context of very low popularity because of a policy failure, say the economy is going badly, then what he argues is that the impeachment itself does not close the crisis because the foundations for the crisis are still there. So we see, and Ecuador is a classic case of that, we see the resurgence of new crises in the short term. Regarding the questions on Venezuela, the issue of characterizing particular actors as radical or not is always tricky. particularly when the actors involved, when actors are collectives that are are coalitions of multiple parties that are quite different among themselves, right, as in the case of Venezuela. Now, if we were to forcing a characterization, which is always unfair to some extent, I would say that the Venezuelan opposition behave on average as a radical actor until maybe 2008. So they supported the failed military coup. Not everyone, right, but important sectors in the opposition supported the military coup. They supported the oil strike against the government at the end of 2002, 2003. And then they supported the abstention in the 2006 election. So all of those are signs of intolerance against the reality that was that the government was, with all its problems, was winning elections. Now, after they founded the Mesa de Unidad Democrática, I think they realized, after the failure of that election, they realized, and they founded the MOOD, they realized that a moderate strategy was going to be not only more successful, but morally more defensible. And so, for the most part, I think they have, on average, they have acted as a moderate actor, even though, of course, we know that there are radical sectors within the opposition, which actually the government wants to encourage, right, because they favor the government. Regarding the military issue, of course, the military in Venezuela is a black box. We don't know exactly. We suspect that the military, there is always divisions in the military. We don't know how much because that's closely guarded. And of course, given the dynamics of military coups, if there is a division in the military and part of the military moves against the government, we will only know when that happens, right? Which will be overnight, as in the Carnation Revolution.
People say that it's a division in the lower ranks of the military.
I suspect that there is first of all a generational division. That is,
yes.
the top ranks are with the government because they get benefits. The lower ranks, I think they mostly have been socialized within the revolutionary ideology, but there is the middle ranks who were trained before, and so I suspect those sectors are more in doubt. Now, among the lower ranks, I think there is a fundamental issue, which is that now their families are suffering
they don't have food.
the economic crisis,
yes.
and they will be called to repress eventually. So when that happens, we don't know what is going to happen. Regarding the issue of political actors, please let me know if I'm missing an important part of your question in one way or another. It seems to me that there are conditions that clearly facilitate the radical strategy, right? There may be actors who have potentially radical preferences in terms of policies, but they never expose those radical preferences, and they operate more or less in a moderate way because they realize that the context, the institutional context, and the political electoral context is adverse to that. So during periods of prosperity, sometimes it's very hard to be a radical actor if one is in the opposition. If one is in government, it's very easy to be a radical actor because one can use the prosperity to push for policy change, right, in a unilateral way. Now, however, there are contexts in which the agreements of the past break down during major, and that's why recessions, economic recessions, are so important, because people feel angry, and so we have popular mobilization and demonstrations, and that's the window of opportunity for actors that had radical preferences, but were forced to behave in a moderate way to develop an effective radicalized strategy. And sometimes, going back to our previous presentation on populism, sometimes it's also the context in which actors that originally had moderate policy preferences realized that being radical or adopting a radical discourse may pay off electorally. So we have this transformational dynamic that all of a sudden may shift the political discourse in the system overnight.
There is one more question from Maria Mimo.
Oh, sorry, yes. It's very convenient that I avoided it. I forgot that question because I don't have an answer for it. We never classified actors in terms of left and right in the study, so I cannot give you an empirical answer for that question. My suspicion, if I had to formulate a hypothesis, would be that, yes, radical actors on the left and the right will have different effects. But that will probably have to do, not in general, but that will probably have to do with the historical context. So when radical actors on the right had international references as alternative models, say during the period of fascism or Frankism in Spain, then the radical right in Latin America could point to a model and say, this is what we want, and liberal democracy is illegitimate, right? When radical actors do not have those models, then it's much harder for them to create an influence. So I suspect that the capacity of radical actors to destabilize the system in part will probably depend on whether they have models on the right or the left that they can follow as an example. So in the case of Podemos, for example, that was mentioned before, I think it's very interesting, the Spanish debate, right? Because the debate about Podemos in Spain all the time goes back to Venezuela. And in part, this is activated from, this is the government, right? The PP activates this image of Venezuela to scare voters regarding Podemos. But at the same time, there is a legitimate issue there, which was that Podemos took Venezuela as a model, right? Was funded by the Venezuelan government, and has been reluctant to condemn repression in Venezuela. And so that connection with the Venezuelan case, it's in some way was an advantage at some point, but now it has become ballast for their party.
Well, the question about how different are the constitutions in Latin America and why the reasons for that. Well, that's a very complex question, but what I can say is that empirically, there are some factors that normally play a very important role in defining the design of the constitution. The first, I think, one of the most impactful is the geography. So the countries where, which are close one to the other, normally have quite similar models of constitution, of course, history. But particularly in Latin America, what's something quite important is that, okay, the 19th century constitutions, most of them, okay, maybe got inspired by the American model, which is quite interesting because in history, if you just look at how the Europe at that time was in the process of constitutionalizing, the Latin America was quite at the same time and even a little bit earlier. So it's quite interesting because Latin America has more than 200 years of constitution. And the moment where Europe got a very strongly constitutionalizing was from the 1948 onwards. So we had more than 50 constitutions being drafted right after that moment. In Latin America, we had some constitutions before that moment. So this is interesting. But the 19th century have these constitutions based somehow on the American model, but in a very particular way, because of course they had to adapt with this, unequal society, and the American society, when they drafted the Constitution, was quite of equal society. So this is what very different when you compare to Latin America, because Latin America had these divisions very strongly in society. Yeah. So yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So this adaptation made it the constitutions, of course, they was inspired by the American model, but they changed a lot. One example, for example, the Supreme Courts. If you look at the Supreme Courts in Latin America, especially the ones which were drafted in the constitutions from the 19th century, you're going to see that most of them follow the same model of, for example, the nominations of the justices and how the maybe someone had a life tenure. The Argentina constitution for some time even having in the college, how the electoral college. So this is interesting. So we had this inspiration. But over the years, this inspiration brought some differences. So we can say nowadays, just to make a more contemporary my argument, some examples. If you look at the Mexican Constitution from the 1917, the Constitution of Mexico was amended more than 700 times. So it's just like a totally new constitution. They just, every year they amend the constitution. So it's a very, I can say, unsystematic constitution, the Mexican one. And it's totally, not totally, but very different from what they had in the 1917. And you cannot compare with some other constitutions maybe in the South. The Argentina constitution they have a completely different perspective of change the constitution. They had one constitution which is the 1853, which was revised sometimes. You're going to see there's some problems there if you contextualize, which is because the presidentialism in the Latin American countries and how it is framed the constitution is also very different. But one important which is also important to mention is that, of course, this is the constitutional design, is the formality. It's how the system is actually formally planned, and sometimes how it is formally developed, like in the judicial review. Reality might connect better the countries in Latin America, how actually the constitutional system is actually applied in reality. So I don't know, just my point is we cannot actually make a homogeneous perspective of Latin America, as quite normally is done in many studies I've worked with.
Okay, we're gonna do one last round real quick. There's a couple of people I wasn't able to include in the first session of questions.
Jan van der Müller. So I found the project on constitutional conceptual change extremely interesting. Two questions / suggestions. So first of all, why limit yourself to Latin America? I mean, if somebody said today, let's look at the South African constitution and let's sort of compare within the African context, people would say no. There is now this movement of global constitutionalism, which maybe normatively one can find quite problematic in certain ways, but there's so many cross-cutting influences now that it's just not obvious why you would sort of limit yourself regionally. Secondly, I think if one takes Koselleck seriously, then these concepts, if they really are crucial concepts in a particular context, they contain a certain time horizon, or even sometimes a philosophy of history. So I wonder whether that, if there's anything to that thought, gives a clue to some of these changes. Because, for instance, if you have a constitution that is constantly amended, it might be understood if basically the constitution becomes a modernization project of sorts. So the constant change sort of opens up a temporal horizon towards a progressive future, for instance. And other constitutions imply a quite different implicit account of time and how a country moves forward in history. So I wonder if that's a way of maybe decoding some of what is happening. Sorry? It's still Jan van der Müller.
This is good. We started with the same identity and we're ending with the same identity. Anyone else has any questions? No?
Can I ask?
Yes, yes.
So I wanted to ask you about neo-constitutionalism. That seems to be an important trend in Latin America, but you didn't mention it.
Can I just, this is a very, I think in my opinion, important point, this idea of neo-constitutionalism. There's a lot being written on neo-constitutionalism, and I actually don't like this concept that much because that's, I cannot actually, of course, and there's a lot of, anxiety about this new constitutionalism. Some people write it as saying that's a kind of, the indigenous people are having their voice, and we have this democracy somehow at the grassroots level. So I don't know. I think even if you compare these countries, I think I'll focus first on the constitution designs. If, for example, Venezuela and let's say Bolivia, of course there's about 10 years difference among one from the other. But I think, for example, how the opposition played in Venezuela and Bolivia are totally different. So totally different, I cannot say, but quite different. So and the Bolivian design, the constitutional design of the Bolivian constitution is much more, I can say there are much more bargains there than actually in the Venezuela. And some baby, and this is the conservative perspective of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is a conservative issue normally, and this has maybe played a role why Bolivia economically had not so many problems as Venezuela. I don't know, it's just a theory. So I don't know how we can say that there's actually new constitutionalism. Well, the idea of new constitutionalism, for example, Gagarella says that it's not new at all because the decentralization of the presidency, this greater lawmaking powers of the president. Actually, it's the old constitutionalism in a new shape. It might be, I think, and I think it's even quite of the rescuing decentralization in a much stronger way than in the past. So maybe there's, but of course there's some aspects which are quite new, I can say. This idea of bringing the people to the, these assemblies and somehow people participating. And also actually, and also interesting the participation of women, for example, in the Ecuadorian Supreme Court and even the Parliament. So this kind of, you have a quota for some groups in some areas. This is something new. In Bolivia, this idea of representation in the Supreme Court, which is very controversial, but is actually an experiment. I think there are a lot of experimentation there. I don't know whether we can say it's something new, but I don't think it's actually so new as normally people say. And I'm not very excited about it. I think it's just a new kind of. There's some positive aspects. I cannot say that they're not positive, especially if you say how unequal these societies are. I think we can understand somehow, I always say, we can understand somehow Chavez in the context of Venezuela, for example. It's not something unpredictable. It's quite very predictable, someone like Chavez to appear there at a certain point. But of course, what followed afterwards was the idea, for example, he had a 93% of government or the Chavistas, the Constitutional Assembly right after the Constitution. This is something very important to mention. We know after the election 1998 and 1990 with the referendum, right afterwards there was something very confusing here, how the Supreme Court and the dialogue of the Supreme Court with this electoral board, which actually at the end defined the Constitutional Assembly, and Chavez had 93% of people of the party there. So you actually didn't have any opposition. It didn't play, of course, a role without a new constitution without opposition almost. So this is something important. We didn't have that in Bolivia as much. We had a lot of protests in Bolivia. We saw that in 2008. I don't know if you can say actually we have a very. I can say, for example, we can make Ecuador, Bolivia quite closer, but even so, it's not that closer. Venezuela, I think it's a little bit more complex. I don't know. Oh, sorry. And your question, why only Latin America? Well, I totally agree with you. The problem, I think, is that I think my scope is already too broad. A lot of concepts, and one thing that I'm struggling very much right now is how I can shorten a little bit this analysis of concepts so complex, such a revolution or maybe a transition or political transition. And if I go to other areas, it might be, or other regions might be even more complex to manage. It's just like a methodological restriction, but I totally think you have much more cross-cultural patterns nowadays than in the past. So, and Koselleck, of course, Koselleck's a kind of inspiration. I think he's the one all the time when we have this idea of conceptual change, he's always comes to my mind, to our mind. It's very, how can I say, very complex thought. It's not that easy. Sometimes it seems very obvious, and it's not that obvious. But I agree with you. I think I have to maybe work a little bit further some aspects of how Koselleck is actually used to here. And I cannot use Koselleck just like a strategic argument to defend my point. It's just, this is, I don't know.
Thank you, Juliano. Thank you, Anibal. So I think we're going to end this panel. We're a little bit over time, and also because we want to have time for the wrap-up. So I'm going to thank Anibal and Juliano, and then we're going to turn over the floor to Brita.
Well, actually, I don't want to keep you here too long because I know you're all already tired and many people have to leave pretty soon. Don't leave this here. And I just want to try to come up with some, or try to make an attempt to, well, wrap it up. It's probably impossible to do justice to all the aspects that were brought up during the day. Just some thoughts on how, based on what we heard today and going from the theoretical conceptualizations to the more concrete perspectives on cases from Brazil, from Latin America more broadly, from Europe. So how could that look like to compare crisis of democracy, or to compare, to put it in more general terms, recent developments of democracy? So, I mean, one possibility could be to start with some sort of taxonomy, to start with key distinctions such as those that we made in the first morning panel, such as acute versus latent crisis, or what are the origins of crisis? Is it endogenous actors, meaning actors that are part of the political system, that are democratically legitimized, or exogenous actors, actors that are extra-institutional in the sense that they are not democratically legitimized? Another distinction could be, especially when looking at actors, whether we are talking about elites / counter-elites or masses as kind of the crucial driving force of crisis. And if we look at endogenous actors, we also have to distinguish between whether it is the government that is propelling the change, or whether it is the opposition, or in general other institutions that are the driving forces of the challenges to democracy. Another distinction that could be useful is the one between norm breaking and norm bending, meaning if we are facing a very clear-cut crisis, breach of democratic norms, or a more ambiguous situation. So just mentioning them, on the basis of all these distinctions, if then we come up with some sort of taxonomy of types of crisis or variants of crisis, this could serve as an analytical framework to apply to different regions and would allow us to compare different regions and maybe analyze which types of, or well, either search for kind of, if we have, say, come up with 3 types or 4 main types, and then look in each region that we are interested in, whether this type is actually present there, and if yes, what it looks like concretely. And this would make it possible to compare across regions. Say, for instance, the question of military coups, yeah, as extra-constitutional or extra-institutional actors challenging an incumbent governments. Does it exist in Latin America? Well, it has been in decline. It was important in historical perspective. Does it exist in Europe after the Second World War? Not so much. Does it exist in Africa? Yes. So we could have map kind of different types of crisis across the regions. Another possibility that this taxonomy would offer is also to detect trends within the regions, such as the example that Anibal presented us, that there was a shift from unambiguous, clear-cut coups that occurred very frequently in the past toward more ambiguous, well, using legal means, which are, however, often very contested. So this is a trend from clear-cut towards ambiguous crisis, and similar trends building on a taxonomy like the one that's based on the several distinctions could be detected for other regions as well. That we see an emergence of, say, increasing semi-loyal opposition forces in Europe over time, or something like that, which maybe was not present that much 20 years ago. Yeah, so this would be one possibility if we want to come up with a clear comparative design, come up with some sort of analytical framework, and then apply it to 2 different regions, or maybe even more regions. Another possibility would be to start more from the types of crisis as such, and start more from the different types that are discussed in the literature, say military coups, impeachments, constitutional changes, interbranch conflicts in general, popular discontent, mass protest that leads to the ouster of a government, or protest voting, or even electoral misconduct or electoral fraud, which are kind of examples of crisis, many of which are very much tied to a particular region, some of which, however, also occur in different regions. And so this could be another possibility for a comparison, to start with these types, and then each section of a book or each chapter or each person investigating this type would explore whether this type is kind of characteristic for a specific region or whether it exists in different regions. And well, this is of course very much focusing on comparing types, comparing variants. Another perspective, another take could be to compare the causes of crisis and to see whether we have different causes in Latin America in comparison to Europe. So for instance, what we've heard about the case of the European Union, this whole issue of having this supranational entity which increasingly centralizes decision-making power, and from the perspective of the individual citizens takes away their influence, their democratic influence on policies, because many of these decisions are being taken in Brussels and no longer on the national governments that they are directly electing. This is, of course, an issue that's quite specific to the European context. On the other hand, what we do have also in other regions is international forces more general, the occurrence of, well, financial markets, capitalisms, international financial institutions, putting up requirements for governments, putting, to some extent, pressure on governments, and therefore disempowering democratically elected governments. So again, this is just a couple of examples for causes, potential causes that could explain why democracy is under challenge, why there is this perception that democracy is in crisis. And again, we could come up with a list of causes and then kind of cross-check whether these causes are relevant in one region, in just one region, or in several regions. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of try to come up with an overarching framework that makes it possible to, or might make it possible to compare the experiences from various regions. And yes, as this goes to the participants, as you know, I kind of put on the floor or put on the table the possibility of a joint publication. We need to discuss that in more detail. We also have a few presentations today that are already published, that are based on already published work, or that are already foreseen for publication somewhere. So we need to see to what extent it will be possible, and we need to discuss this further, and I am pretty sure we'll keep in touch. And as I promised, I'll put together a participant list, and we continue the discussion. And yeah, before I come to the final round of thanking everybody, and I just want to open the possibility for any suggestions from the audience, from the participants. In terms of comparison, in terms of perspectives, any suggestions, anything that you would like to raise?
What is not clear for me what can be the goal out of such a workshop. Should it be a publication? This is not clear to me. If it should be a publication, I'm rather skeptical that there is first a critical mass of papers you need for such a publication. And the second one is there are quite different cases, themes, and concepts. And if you want to have a chance to get an edited volume published, you must have, so to say, the autocratic claim that the rest of the contribution should follow somehow the concept. So this is not what we have done so far, and It would need probably another 2 workshops to do it. I don't want to be over skeptical and over critical, but maybe this is this kind of Teutonic realism which makes us so sympathetic. The second point is, if I would start, then I would start with a problem. I would start then, which is the puzzle we want to address. I would not start in a Weberian sense with a taxonomy. I would say, this is a puzzle we have. These are the concepts, and this is what we want to find out. But this is something you have to think about, whether it's worthwhile, because you have probably the workload to do it, and I cannot say anything more for it.
Any others?
I just want to, of course, just following his argument. I also know that it's very complicated, for example, for adding a volume with different perspectives, different ideas. But on the other hand, I think it might also work. It's not a, I don't know how the political science spectrum for publication. I can say that, for example, in the law departments or the law area, it might be something possible. I don't know. It's just to not make that pessimist idea that it's not possible at all to publish some papers, even though they are not that so much connected one from the other. And I think actually there are some connections here. So I'm more on the side of thinking that it might be possible. Of course, you have to draft like a guideline from where we have to draw from maybe the main ideas. Somehow this might result in rewriting some of these papers, which are maybe working papers already, but I think it's possible. And I think it should be, there should be something. I don't like the idea of finishing a workshop and at the end just like we just debated here and we brought some ideas without having a product in the end. So I think we should actually focus on that, because otherwise it's going to be something very, very strict to us here, which is, okay, a good audience, but they're tiny ones. So I think we should really look forward to writing something together, or different, of course. Yeah. And thank for the I think it was very good. So I want to thank again for the workshop. It was really, yeah, good.
Just one thought. So I think that whatever the overall topic might be, has to be more specific than democracy in crisis. So if you think of existing volumes that do a European Latin American comparison, think for instance of the book that Casmude and Rovira Caldwasser edited about populism. I think that works because there is something that can meaningfully be compared, and it's more specific than just democracy in general. So one suggestion might be to basically take up the work that was done this morning by you and Wolfgang and say, here are these specific aspects of democracy. Some of the stresses are maybe similar in terms of, very broadly speaking, globalization puts pressure on a specific aspect of democracy. Now, how do these two systems in country X and Y react to this? What are the interesting differences? How do we see these phenomena play out differently? But I think unless it's disaggregated into specific aspects or spheres of democracy, it just goes off in too many directions. So I don't want to, it's meant to be a constructive suggestion, even if it might not have sounded this way.
Yeah, thank you very much for the inspiring comments, for the feedback. Yeah, I mean, this ideas I briefly mentioned here were not meant to be all included into the framework. It's just a couple of, just meant to suggest that we would need some sort of common ground, that we would need some sort of analytical starting point, be it a concrete question, a concrete problem, a concrete aspect of what aspect of democracy is in challenge, what are the causes of democracy for being in challenge, and then focus on this. So this was just a number, it was a big panorama. It wasn't meant to be kind of the analytical framework. I think it was maybe a bit misleading. Anyway, thank you to all of you, and I don't have the solution right now. I'm sorry, but I mean, we won't lose contact, and I think we'll continue the discussion, and we'll figure out how to proceed with this. And we also have the plan to put together a few panels at conferences next year, also exploring the topic of crisis of democracy, or more specifically looking at Latin American versus European cases. So that's another possibility to maybe also, what was also mentioned here, that of course the papers that were presented, or the presentations that were made in this conference would not be enough. We would have to recruit additional people, probably, depending very much on what the exact focus of the publication would be. And so this it probably would be expecting too much to think that within one conference we could come up immediately with a solution, at least if we want it to be a good volume and not just a collection of, a random collection of, of all the contributions that were made, and keeping in mind anyway that some of them are already published. Anyway, so now thank you to all of you who were here, who accepted my invitation, who came here as audience, who accompanied us online. And I would like to appreciate also very much the hospitality here in the Instituto de Estudos Avanzados. We received a lot of, I received a lot of very positive comments about the room. So I'm very happy that we could organize the event here. And yeah, and I'm very grateful also for the support of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. So it was a collaborative effort from various sides, and I think that's great. And even though the ARD formally requires me not to cooperate with anyone, which is kind of strange because this visiting professorship is meant to inspire cooperation. At the same time, I should not accept funds for anyone else. But I mean, there are legal loopholes around that. So I've done it before. I'm fine with it, and I think it's actually good to. Yes, anyway, it doesn't matter. You can quote me on this. It's a critique I've written to them already, so don't worry about it. Anyway, so yeah, I would like to, I very much appreciate all the efforts, all this support that I received, and yeah, and thank you very much for coming here.